is now begun. First, we'll start with approval of the minutes. Do we have any changes to the minutes?
No.
I do not.
I move to accept the minutes as presented.
Okay.
I'll second.
All in favor? Aye. Moving on. Public participation for items not identified in a public hearing. And we have, it looks like we've got quite a few more. These are for the master plan. Okay. So the first speaker would be Hans Price.
Good evening. My name is Hans Price. I live at 1719 Mariposa Avenue here in Boulder. I'm with the Boulder Mountain Bike Alliance. I have a couple things I want to bring to the board's attention tonight. The first thing is, back in October, I had the unique opportunity to travel to Lake Tahoe together with a colleague of mine, Jason Vogel. And we traveled with 4 OSMP staff members from Jim Reeder's Trails and Facilities team. We met with the U.S. Forest Service. The area around Lake Tahoe is known for its elaborate and really well-built network of multi-use trails, and we wanted to study those. The U.S. Forest Service is extremely understaffed and underfunded, and so they are building and maintaining this trail network with the help of volunteers, and that was part of what we wanted to learn. The trail system 15 years ago was at the verge of a complete shutdown because of lack of funding and because of a lot of rogue trail building, these kind of things. And it was really interesting to learn how they attacked these problems and they turned it around. And now there's a network of dozens and dozens of miles of really well-built trails, and they are maintained by volunteers. They're patrolled. They're self-policing. There's only a few Forest Service staff members that do the oversight. And just briefly, we sat down in a conference room with the Forest Service for several hours where we discussed these items. Volunteer engagement, how to curb illegal activity, these kind of things, liability, avoid user conflicts, signage, all these things were discussed. It was really interesting, eye-opening. How to give volunteers a sense of accomplishment, that they want to preserve what they built, these kind of things. And we also got to ride some of those awesome trails on our bikes. Just briefly, second thing I wanted to say, just this Monday, three of us from Boulder Mountain Bike Alliance spent 2.5 hours with OSMP staff in South Boulder on South Boulder trails, looking at problem areas between Marshall Mesa, High Plains, Greenbelt, and it was interesting that the problem spots that we had on our list pretty much matched the problem spots that OSMP had on their list. Erosion and making trails more sustainable. So we came out of this 2.5-hour bike ride with a list of projects for next year and probably 2019.
Hans, excuse me, I might need to wrap up. Yeah.
Just appreciate the opportunity and looking forward to building on these successes over in 2018.
Thank you, Hans. The next one is Alan Delamere.
Alan Delamere, 525 Mapleton Avenue. My topics that I've got, the three topics. Ryan can go to the next. Okay. I'm just giving an update on the senator's censuses. I have 4 copies of my latest thing, which you can have much more data if you want it. The other thing is the master plan, I think is far too complex. And the third topic is the lack of response to our letters on the open space other. On the senator's centers, all the centers have been removed. The summer data I analyzed, the staff were very supportive and sent me all the data that they took from June, July, and August, and it showed a slight decrease over 2016. And I think the reason is that Lyons Lair came online, and there are no sensors on the south side of Sunshine Canyon. So we're only getting a fraction of the data available. So we need more sensors in place, and I think that we should really have another year's worth of data with full sensors, Tracy. I don't know whether you can make that happen or not, but that seems to me, if we're going to ever get good numbers on that area, we need to do the measurements properly. Okay, the master plan, I attended the committee meeting today and I made a brief presentation to that, and I'm left asking the question of why do we need such a massive effort? And that completely escapes me. The scale of this master plan activities is huge, and Tom and Kurt supported him today, asked the question of what is the problem? And if somebody can explain that to me, I'd be much happier. It's an excessively detailed process that will take a long time to implement. And the real crux are the implementation plans. You know, we've got the top level, the master plan, and then we get the implementation plans. If we've got a specific topic, whatever it is, that needs to be addressed, we need those plans, and we need them to be visible to the public and shared by the public. So the top level is good, but we don't need to take the bottom level and bring it up into the top level. So my last topic there is, I've been talking to you now for 18 months or more about open space parking at Senatus. When are we ever going to get serious on it? I got fobbed off by the staff saying, oh, wait for the master plan. That will solve everything. Well, we've got the problem now. And if any of you have tried parking on a Saturday or Sunday morning between 9 and noon, you'll find that you're parking down in the streets further below, or you're going onto the 311 site to park. Okay? So my last topic is we have been sending letters to you and staff for a long time, and we're getting no response. We don't even get, thank you very much for your letter, from anybody. So we are really concerned that we're being ignored, and staff on the planning side are moving ahead with the 311 for removing open space other. They just sent a letter this week to the county saying they intend to remove open space other because of mapping discrepancy. Now this to me is unacceptable to the public. We really need a public hearing on the removal process long before staff start sending letters off to the county. So please join us and give us some help in understanding exactly why we're being ignored. Thank you.
Thank you, Alan. And Coral Anuda.
Good evening. My name is Carl Anuda. I'm a member of the Board of Directors of Historic Boulder. For some time, we have been concerned about the condition of the preservation and the use of farm buildings and other agricultural structures on city open space. We understand that there are possibly some significant acquisitions in the pipeline in the near future, which may have or do have both history and architecturally significant buildings. The council's, the city's stated policy is to lead by example and to carefully take care of the many buildings that the city owns. A problem has been that there is limited funds and limited staff time for restoration, preservation, and use of these structures. Historic Boulder would like 15 minutes of your time next week, or next month rather, in January, to present to you a concept proposal on what we can do and with ideas concerning the question of these buildings. We hope that we will be able to suggest means to avoid staff time, reduce or avoid city costs and expenses, and we may even be able to find some outside funds to assist. Within the next week or 10 days, we will provide you with a summary of our conceptual ideas. We hope you can give us time next month and incorporate some of our ideas into your master plan, and we would like to chat with you then. Thank you very much. We look forward to speaking with you in January.
Thank you, Carl. So I guess, okay. Kirk Cunningham.
My name is Kirk Cunningham, 977 7th Street in Boulder. I'm speaking on behalf of the Sierra Club, Boulder County tonight. This is on the long-range management plan, preparations for that, is that correct?
Should that be?
Well, that, you're going to be speaking about the master plan process.
Yes.
And that should be later.
Okay, all right.
Yeah. So, moving on to matters from the department.
We have an update on the City of Boulder Engagement Framework and Sarah Huntley, who is the new engagement manager. Did I get that correctly? From the city manager's office. Are you in the city manager's office? Okay.
Too. Good evening. As Tracy said, my name is Sarah Huntley. I am taking on a new role in the city, although I've been here for 10 years. My new role is as engagement manager, and I'm pleased to be able to speak with you tonight about this new initiative, and after we get through a brief presentation, answer some questions that you might have. So this evening, see if this works. It does. Okay. This evening, we're here to talk about this new citywide engagement effort, which is an effort to accomplish a couple of different goals. One is to enhance the city's relationship with the community that we serve. The other is to ensure that opportunities for input are inclusive, meaningful, and actually get heard to inform next steps when appropriate. The other goal, which isn't on this slide but is really important, I think, to the purpose of creating this centralized program, is to try to be more consistent across the city. So community members have sometimes told us that they feel like they're working with many, many different cities when they work with the city of Boulder. They can engage with the library in one way, they engage with open space in a different way, they engage with planning in a totally different way. So trying to help people know what to expect in terms of the engagement and what it means. The reason I'm here tonight is that many of our boards and commissions, including yours, already play a role, as we can see from the public participation session you just went through, of collecting input and being able to respond to community concerns. And one of the things we're going to be doing at 2018 is exploring whether there are changes to strengthen that connection that you might be interested in, trying to figure out how the citywide program can support the engagement that occurs at this level and in these types of meetings. So I wanted to start with a little bit of history. You're probably familiar with the Public Participation Working Group. This is a group that City Council formed back in January of 2016, and that was in recognition that while we do some engagement very well, there have been other engagement efforts that haven't met the needs of our community or met the needs of decision makers who are counting on that input. So they wanted to do ironically, they wanted to engage the community in a discussion about engagement. So they appointed this committee. It was 14 members, community members. Some folks have experience, professional background in engagement and facilitation, public participation. Others did not. They were community members who simply had experienced it as a community member and wanted to make a positive difference. It was staffed by 2 staff members, and City Council member Lisa Morzell was also a part of those discussions. This committee worked very hard. They met over 30 times over a year-and-a-half period of time, so this was not a light commitment on their part. They looked at past cases of city engagement efforts. They really explored industry best practices, and they came up with a report that if you haven't seen, I definitely recommend that you take a look at it. It's online. It's a gold mine of recommendations of things we could do better. One of the things they started out with was identifying a series of problems. What are they hearing from the community? And that's included in the report. One of the problems that they were hearing from a lot of people is that people weren't sure how their input was being used. There's input on lots of different agenda items going on at one time. Sometimes people don't understand the decision-making process itself, so what's the next step? So they looked at the problems, and then perhaps more importantly for us in terms of figuring out how to improve things, they came up with some core values and principles that should guide our work as we look for solutions. And I wanted to share those with you this evening. The core principles and values are spelled out in these 5 statements. They're very consistent with a lot of the best practices in terms of public participation and what makes people feel like their participation matters. So they start out with saying the problem is clearly defined. I kind of am a little bit more of a positive person. I like to say the opportunity is more clearly defined, but nonetheless, people know why we're embarking on a process. Public engagement is thoughtfully planned. All voices are encouraged and included. Public contribution and civil participation are fostered, and the process is trustworthy and transparent. So those are the building blocks that they're recommending, and they form the basis of their recommendations as well as the staff implementation plan to make what they said a reality in our community. Like I said, this report was a gold mine, lots of nuggets of wisdom and information. They ended up summarizing a lot of their bulleted recommendations under 2 overarching themes. One was that they want us to work with the city and the community, we both have roles to play in this, in changing the culture of engagement in Boulder, so people feel like it is more meaningful than they have felt sometimes in years past. That's a pretty broad category, and we're going to talk a little bit more about the effort staff is making to make that more concrete in just a minute. The second one is a more specific recommendation, which is that they want us to utilize a comprehensive decision-making process. We have committed to that, and we're going to talk a little bit about what that process is. Starting with their wisdom that we need to have a why statement, a purpose statement for why we're doing anything differently than the way we've done it in the past. A group of 10 staff members got together to look at the public participation working group and start to put bones on a strategic framework for the city. And we decided we better start with a why statement, a purpose statement. So we came up with this. The city's working to improve its engagement culture and processes because we recognize that local government makes better decisions and creates more responsive programs and services when the community it serves has a meaningful voice. And we said that some adjectives that would describe what we think best engagement looks like is appropriately scaled, so we engage in the areas where community members most want to engage with us, consistent and reliable, inclusive, and respectful of everybody. So I'm presenting this consistent with the 2 recommendations that the PPWG makes because I think that's the easiest way to see how all these components nest together. So they talked about wanting to make culture change, and we interpreted that into an objective that we need to both create and sustain a culture and a practice, because those two things go hand in hand, of meaningful civic engagement in the city of Boulder in order to achieve outcomes that reflect our community's concerns, aspirations, and shared values. We said that it needs to be both, this culture change, everything we do to be able to promote a culture change needs to be both authentic and strategic. Because culture change is such a amorphous idea, first of all, I want to say the PPWG was very wise in recognizing that culture change does not happen overnight, that it takes time. They talked about it as being a 5 to 7 year process. And I would imagine that when you embark on a culture change journey, there are some ebbs and flows. Sometimes you make great progress, and sometimes there's a little bit of a misstep, and we intend to be very reflective about that and learn from our experiences with each other. But we felt like we needed to put a little bit more concreteness on that concept. So the staff committee came up with 6 strategies that we think will be important for us to do in 2018 and a little bit into 2019 to get this culture change off on the right foot. And the strategies are here. I don't expect you to be able to read this fine print. I just wanted to give you a sense of the areas of work that we plan to focus on. There is, in your packet, there's a printout of the document we created, and I'm happy to answer any questions or talk to you individually after this meeting if you have comments that are specific to that document. But the areas that we felt like were really representative of the types of tasks the PPWG said would be important fell into 6 categories. One was learning together. We're starting something new, and as I said, some of that's going to go great and some of it isn't. So what are the best practices we're aiming for? Making sure we have a shared vocabulary between decision makers, staff members, community members. So that's going to be a big part of our work in 2018. Helping people know what to expect. So that was a lot of what the PPWG heard from community members. They didn't really know when the best time was to engage, how their information was going to be used, where to go to find things. So we want people to understand that in a much more clear, delineated way. And in fact, when you talk about the master plan process a little later this evening, there's something that they're calling engagement windows, which is an attempt to be very clear about that with our community. The other one, the third one, is cultivate respectful relationships. We want to make sure that we are not just engaging with the community around the project of the day, the policy decision of the day, but actually be able to develop two-way meaningful relationships so the community can bring issues to us that might not even be on our work plan, and we can start to get them on staff's radar and work together towards solutions. That's also the bucket of work where we really want to try to make our processes more inclusive. We recognize that a lot of the engagement opportunities we have now have barriers built in for some members of our community, particularly people with small children. This is a very difficult time in the evening to come. I know I had to have my children taken care of this evening to be here, so we want to make sure that there's lots of opportunities for different voices to be heard. This is not to minimize any voice that's already being heard. It's to augment the voices in the room so we get enough perspectives to make informed decisions. We want to be transparent. I think that pretty much goes without saying, but we've already identified some areas in which we think we could have some meaningful process improvement discussions, largely around city council and council correspondence and transparency about how council members are voting. So we're going to have some work items in 2018 that tackle that issue. Using the right tools. So you probably have heard this because I know I've heard it. Our website is not really that great for people finding things. There's a lot of information there, but you have to know what layer to get to that information. So we are going to be working on a web refresh in 2018 in conjunction with our communications and IT departments. The goal of that is really to create an entirely different navigation system so that community members can look for things based on topic rather than having to know which staff member in which division, in which department handles that issue. So bears would be a great example. There's some great information on bears and interfacing with the urban environment on the OSMP sites. There's some great information in planning and parks and recreation, and the idea is that people would be able to find all information on that topic by going to a centralized topic site. So we're going to be working on that. Also using the right tools in terms of when do we use social media and what do we use it for. We're talking about restarting an engagement platform, an online platform where people can engage in discussion groups with community member to community member, not just staff. So we're really going to be looking at trying to bolster those opportunities. And then lastly, this is going to be a learning experience, so we want to be able to evaluate and evolve. One of the things I think community members will see that's a little different is at the end of each phase of a project, all projects in the city, we're going to try to be diligent about asking, how did that process work? Not do you like the outcome, but how did that process work for you, and what could we do better in the future so that we can continue to learn? This is the decision-making process that the Public Participation Working Group suggested, and this has in fact been adopted by council as a decision-making process we're going to use. This really is for engagement where the end result is going to be some kind of decision. There's other forms of engagement that are equally important, but this is clearly when you're driving to an end decision. And it starts with that step one of defining the issue before embarking, which I think some folks have been really interested in talking about as part of the master planning process. And it's got some specific steps built in where there's deliberate planning, deliberate thought, and reporting out. I would say that steps 4 through 6, which is sharing a foundation of information inquiry, identifying options, prioritizing those options, and leading up to a recommendation to a decision-making body such as yourself or city council, depending on the issue, that's the area in which we're probably going to have the most robust participation and engagement on most projects. There's also room for engagement in all of the other areas, and we want to be able to explore how we can do that better as well. But that's the place where I think you're going to see the most activity. As part of the planning process, one of the other components that we want to implement, which is consistent with a best practice recommended by an organization called the International Association of Public Participation. I didn't know such a thing existed, but they actually have a really solid foundation and curriculum. And one of the things they talk about is being very clear up front in a process as to what things the community can impact in a decision and what things they can't impact. Maybe there's a federal regulation that we have to follow, and we can talk about whether that federal regulation should be there for hours, but the reality is it's there. And so let's really focus the engagement around the places where the community can have an impact. And then also they talk about being very clear about what level of engagement you're at. So this is a spectrum here. Again, I don't expect you to be able to read the fine print. It is in the printouts that were part of your packet. But this is 4 categories that we plan to use as we talk about engagement, and it goes all the way from inform to collaborate. It goes from left to right. I don't mean to imply that farther you get on the scale is better. It really depends on what your objectives are. But if you're an inform and a little bit of consult, we're making a commitment to the community that we're going to keep you apprised of what's going on. But this probably isn't a phase where there's an opportunity for a lot of two-way dialogue. As you move further into a process, it's likely, particularly as you get down the wheel to those areas of 4, 5, and 6, that we're going to be more along consult, involve, or collaborate. In each one of those levels, there's a different promise being made to the community. So the highest level that the city is committing to is collaborate, and that says that we're going to work together. We're going to roll up our sleeves at a table, around the table, and come up with solutions together, and the decision makers who have to really decide how to proceed are making a commitment that they're going to take that public input into consideration to the maximum extent possible. So that's a significant promise to the community members who agree to give that kind of time and passion to an issue. It goes down a little bit depending on which area you're at, and again, the level of appropriateness depends on how many stakeholders you're talking about, what is the complexity of the issue, what issues are actually on the table, and which issues have probably already been decided by things that are beyond our control. But this is a shared vocabulary we want to start to have with our community. Just want to quickly cover a little bit about who, because I've had people say, well, this sounds great, Sarah, but this sounds like it's going to take a lot of work, and it is. And it's going to take work both within the city and within our community with allies who are really interested in making the process itself be more effective for everybody. In terms of the city, the 2018 budget included 2 centralized full-time staff resources. One of those is the position that I'm now sitting in, which is the engagement manager in the city manager's office. I have just posted an opening that the city is hiring an engagement specialist who will also work full-time on these issues. We are absolutely going to have to work in a collaborative way with departments. A lot of our departments have really good experts already in them on engagement, communications, and outreach, and so we intend to work closely with those folks because there's no way that 2 of us can manage and facilitate engagement on every topic that's going on in the city. We are also very fortunate that at the beginning of 2017, we had staff members who said, we know this process is going on with the Public Participation Working Group. We want to be respectful of that process, but we have some great ideas too of things we'd like to see happen. And so we formed a staff committee that now has 25 members from about 11 or 12 different departments who are passionate about these issues, who are now both enacting ideas of their own. If you were able to go to the event in October that we had that was called What's Up Boulder, that was an idea that came out of that committee where we had essentially an information festival where people could go learn about a whole host of topics and projects the city was doing instead of having to make time to go to 15 or 20 different open houses. It was incredibly successful, and that originated from staff, and they were the ones who both thought of it and made it a reality. So I was really proud of the work they did there. They also now are taking this Public Participation Working Group report and saying, okay, how do we take these great ideas? How do we prioritize the work? And how do we go back out into our departments and make people understand what we're trying to do? We also will be working with our neighborhood and community liaisons and partnering very closely with communications and information technology because several of the goals in terms of using the right tools, some of those tools are digital. They're not all digital. I want to be very clear. We're still going to have in-person engagement opportunities, but we want to give a range of options for people. And communications, that inform and consult part of the spectrum, that's largely communications. And if you're in that place, we better make sure we're very clear in what we're presenting to the community. If you're any place else on the spectrum, you can't be anyplace else on the spectrum without communicating clearly first. So we are definitely joined at the hip, and that's the department that I actually came from. So I have good, solid relationships, and we'll be continuing to understand the difference between the 2 areas and how we can work together. One of the things that council asked us to do, recognizing that you can't take on everything at one time, is to try to choose some projects that could be pilot projects, not only because the community is very interested in them, but we can try to be real deliberate and diligent in terms of the processes that we're going to follow so we can learn from this whole experience. You'll notice, I think, something that you already know, which is that the OSMP master plan is at the top of that list. So the process committee has been spending a lot of time looking at process. And that process is both project process and project trajectory, but also engagement, which goes hand in hand. Some of the other ones that I'm working on with staff are the Central Broadway corridor, which includes both Alpine Balsam and the east bookend of the civic area, accessory dwelling units, community broadband, and the fire master plan. What it means to be a pilot project is that the engagement team, such as we are, two strong, 2 people strong, plus the engagement coordination committee, that we are committing to staff those projects with equal partners, so they'll have an engagement representative at all of their meetings as they plan things to make sure that we're following the processes. Other projects, I currently have about 49 on my board of projects that departments think could involve some level of engagement in the city of Boulder in 2018. That's a little daunting. So while we get this program up and running, we're also trying to create toolkits and training opportunities so that people can kind of start to get the basic principles and self-manage some of the projects until we get a chance to go to every department and help them understand what we're trying to do. Another related action item that council asked us to include specifically has to do with boards and commissions. So some boards and commissions have said, maybe we could play a different role in improving engagement. Others have said, I really would like to, but we're quasi-judicial, so I don't really know what's appropriate. So tonight is just the beginning of a conversation of what you like about the way you currently engage with the community, what you don't like, some areas in which we might be able to brainstorm together, ways that you could try new things that we could then share with this larger citywide effort. And so we're going to get to a couple of questions about that in just a minute. I guess we're to the questions now. So the three questions, and I will leave it to the chair to sort of talk about how you would like to go through these questions, but the three questions that we really wanted to be able to respond to this evening is, do you have questions about the framework itself? And I've really given you a cursory overview because I'm trying to respect the other agenda items you have tonight. I'm happy to talk offline if that's easier for you, or to answer whatever questions you think might be most relevant tonight. The second one is really the meat of the start of this conversation, I think, is what roles have you feel like you played in the past? Is there a desire to continue the role as is, or modify the role in terms of how you engage with the community and take their input and take it into account for your decisions and share it with staff for other decisions? And then lastly, it's my understanding that this group has asked about the possibility of having some engagement, or really even more communication-related tools and training, and I can help coordinate that for the year of 2018, but it would be helpful for me to understand what kind of topics you'd both be interested in covering so that we can make sure we meet your needs. So with that, I open up the floor to whatever questions you might have.
Well, I guess I'd have a thought that it might be a discussion that we come back to you on, or
Sure.
do we want to answer these questions now? I'm not sure. We can certainly tackle them one by one.
I think whatever the board would like to do, I'm sort of teeing up the questions. I realize that whatever we talk about tonight won't be the only conversation, but if you'd like to take some more time to absorb, take a look at the framework some more, I'm certainly happy to come back to this forum.
What do we want to do?
Well, I definitely have some initial questions about the framework that I'd appreciate the opportunity to ask.
Okay.
Should we just kick off with that?
Let's just start.
Okay, thank you. So on the engagement spectrum,
Yes.
Going from to inform to collaborate, is there the expectation that all processes to which we apply this spectrum, or this process, will go all the way from inform to collaborate and possibly back down again? Or will there be some processes where we say, we're only going to rise as high as consult on this particular process?
Correct. There's going to be a decision made for each process.
Okay.
One of the things that's interesting is the International Association of Public Participation says, pick a level of the spectrum for your whole project.
Okay.
The way we do projects in Boulder, that's not really going to work, because we tend to do projects in a very phased, deliberate way.
Okay.
And so I would imagine that almost every project, when it starts off, phase 0 to phase 1, you're going to mostly be doing a lot of informing, right? Because you want to create a foundation where people understand what you're trying to do and why, right? Mm-hmm. And then depending on what needs to happen in each of the phases, the complexity of the issue, the interest of stakeholders, you may go up to consult on something, you may go up to collaborate on something. What I'm trying to get the city to be able to be clear about is what's the highest level of engagement for the project, and who's going to be most interested in engaging there, and how do we accommodate that interest and need.
Okay, thank you. That's a useful clarification for me. I appreciate it.
I would guess, and I haven't gone through the important discussion phase with every department who's come to me with an engagement project for 2018, but I would guess that roughly a third of the 48 that I've come to my attention so far probably were talking inform and consult.
Okay.
And then, the other projects will fall into the different categories. there's no right or wrong. You really just need to understand what the stakeholders' needs are, what the impact of the decision is going to be on people, and what the objectives are of the engagement. You don't want to have a big collaboration around a question that we really don't have any control over.
Right.
That's just going to frustrate everybody.
Yeah.
Right?
Understood. Can you come back to me in a minute? I'm not sure how to phrase my next question.
Other questions?
Could you elaborate a bit on the projects for which these set of principles are supposed to apply? I mean, it's obvious that if you engage in a 2-year master plan, that it's envisioned that you're going to go through the 9 steps. We do lots of things, as I'm sure every board does, some of which are confined to a single meeting where it wouldn't be practical to go through some, elaborate public participation process. And then there's everything down to where, one person speaks for 3 minutes, and you can probably see where this is going. It strikes me as there's an opportunity that we sort of miss where someone speaks to us, agree or disagree with their point, but often, we then start talking about public participation, but it's, there's that whole opportunity that they were raising a question, and in this case, they've left. But I think I'd be curious as to your sense of the extent to which we ought to apply these principles to sort of smaller scale things, whether it's something that we roll out because it's on our agenda, or if it's something that the public brings to us.
I think that's a really good question, and I think we're going to be learning a little bit about where it works best and where it doesn't work so well as we go. And that's not a very satisfying answer, I know, but we're both creating a program and trying to improve and implement engagement strategies at the same time. I do think that the principles of people feeling like the process and how things work in the city are trustworthy and transparent, those principles are inherent to any interaction we have with community members. I think the process that we talk about, that the more complex the issue is and the more we think that community input can influence the outcome, the more important it is that we're following that process. Now, it's a 9-step process that can feel very cumbersome to people. I'll tell you that the first 3 steps can often happen in one conversation if there's clarity. Right? So I think that they fleshed out 9 steps, and I think it was an important contribution because they want to make sure we're just asking ourselves the right questions as we go along, so we don't miss the important idea of, okay, who might this decision impact, and who's not at the table, so we can think about bringing those people to the table in a creative way. I think, the pilot project sort of rose to the top as the obvious choices because of the intensity of the effort, the likelihood that they will guide future decisions, and have other plans nested within them. But some of the 48 other, the 48 board things I have on the board, some of them, we could make an argument either way of whether they go across the wheel, and it's really going to depend a lot on what our community says they want us to be doing.
So I have a question, again, relating, excuse me, to these 9 steps. It's sort of an interesting bit of serendipity that this morning I was reading this, and then I had a meeting with a group of constituents here from Boulder about the master plan process, and then we just heard from Alan Delamere about a different sort of process, although then he also talked about the master plan process. In both cases, the conversations that I had seemed to focus on the fact that step 1 seems to be that something that the public wants to be involved with. And I was wondering if that then leads you to this sort of fractal within fractal of like, so we have a step 1 that's define the problem, which is to define the problem, which is to define the problem.
Right.
Because I almost feel as if what's happened most of the time with issues that come to here is we see it if cooked all the way down to step 4 or step 5. When even our board, I think we want step 1.
Right.
And I feel like that might be a really good question, is how do we dig into the fractal to the point where the public feels more comfortable getting to 4 or 5 because they already had a public process that was define the issue.
Right. This is one of the things that we're struggling with when we are ready as we start to implement this wheel. And there was a good discussion about it at the process committee, and I'll let those presenters on your later agenda item talk about where we sort of landed on that for this particular topic. But in general, to answer your question, so the challenging issue for us is that Boulder is not taking on very many issues that are brand new. I mean, we do take on new issues, but my point is there's been conversations and discussions and public discourse on some of these things that happened for a number of years. So if you're taking on a brand new challenge, we probably should stop everything and have a conversation about those challenges. If you're taking on an issue that's sort of getting us to the next phase of a problem or an opportunity, you're probably going to be informed to some extent by all the public process and conversations that have already happened. So generally what I'm telling staff is we can start out by saying this is our proposed why statement, and then start to get some community feedback about whether that why statement is clear enough. Does it take into account all of the issues that the community would like to discuss as we go through this new process? And that's kind of where we are in the master planning process, is some community members have said this is not clear enough. We want to be much more clear, both because we think the clarity is important, but also if you want people to engage, you better make them understand why this is important, and we have maybe not done that in a concrete enough way. So again, I'll let the process presentation deal with that more specifically. But I think trying to figure out what the right mix is for the different topics on when we go out and get feedback. For Alpine Balsam, for example, we've sent a postcard to people who live in that part of town and said, this is our proposed purpose statement. What do you think? So there's different ways to try to get feedback on those types of things, but they're often informed by long-standing, ongoing conversations. They are not usually something we're looking at for the very first time. So that's a good place to start, is what I'm saying, and then you can ask people if that's adequate or not, and if it's not, you need to adjust.
Okay.
I had a question about elasticity. I guess it's similar to what Kevin was talking about. Seems like, we can start at step 1, get to step 4, and then realize that some of the steps are overlooking significant people for input. Mm-hmm. So how much elasticity is there? Are there ways to kind of backtrack?
I think we have to be able to adjust as we go based on things we learn along the way. Okay. One of the purposes of trying to have some robust conversations up front is to avoid those aha surprises that happen mid-process to the extent that we can. But the reality is these are really fluid conversations, and someone might come in at step 4 with a really good point that we hadn't thought about. Generally speaking, we want to move from one step to the next step and not go backwards, but I also think we need to be cognizant that these are often complex issues, and things might come to our attention that weren't part of the initial discussion.
I guess I have a bureaucratic question.
Okay.
Because I come from a large organization, and this is all great, and I think it's great you're doing the pilot studies. I agree with you, 30-something would be way too many probably for this year. There's a lot of things that are described here as activities that we hope to do. Mm-hmm. I would have a very hard time writing the memo to the department saying what your obligations and responsibilities are for this. I mean, it's sort of...
So I've started
here. Is that what?
I've been starting to write that memo, and it is very challenging. Yeah. I'm trying to get it down to, 10 things that we're asking you to do differently as we get started on this journey together. And some of the things that we're asking, for example, is that step number 2, where you think about your stakeholders, you don't just ask yourselves who has been interested in this issue in the past. You ask yourselves what are the impacts likely to be of the decisions we make, and who's going to be impacted. And if they're not at the table, let's identify who those people are and talk together about how to bring them to the table more successfully. So there's some steps that are in the planning process itself. We're also asking staff to participate as we offer trainings, to just become more familiar with the terminology and the vocabulary so that we're all talking the same language when we say we're going to involve the community. We've got a decision maker training that we're planning for council that's currently scheduled for February. So these are some ways people can plug in.
Do you see departments identifying leads for this area?
Yes, so how it generally is working is that the liaison that they sent to the Engagement Coordination Committee is their lead in terms of being able to basically bring information back from the centralized effort to the department and vice versa. I mean, it's very important that we understand what departments need and what order in which they think it would be most helpful. Like, it's a training on the levels probably ought to come first before you start talking about a training on how to design a particular session, engagement session. So we're trying to stage and phase and prioritize our work based on what departments think would be most effective.
Yeah, right. You know, last, I would just echo what Tom was saying. I do think we're interested in exploring different hybrid models that aren't quite so static as we tend to spend most of our time doing, so.
Yeah.
Okay, do we want to go to the second one, or you feel like what roles has the board played in promoting positive engagement in the past? And is there a desire to continue or modify this role moving forward?
Well, if I could go ahead, to build off of what Tom was saying, in terms of like the 3-minute input we get from the community sometimes, one thing I've struggled with is I feel like we're an important microphone for the community. They can come to us, but then what do we do with that information? Where do we move forward? And so I have a desire to modify how I've felt our role has been so far, which is to absorb, but then what do we do? I need more direction and a way to help our community move forward through that public input.
So that's something we hear often, both from community members and people who are sitting here behind these chairs, is that it's not an opportunity for two-way conversation. It's you take this information and you're not really sure what to do with it, and the community member's not really sure what you're going to do with it. So it's not a very pleasant experience for folks. We're not really suggesting taking away these approaches, because some of these, like public hearings, for example, in many cases are required by law, but we're talking about augmenting them with other opportunities. Some boards have talked about maybe having some listening sessions where they can just pull up some chairs and people can talk about their concerns and board members can give their feedback. Some things that we'll be doing on the staff side that boards and commissions might want to think about is we're going to be doing a much better job of doing what we call a feedback loop. So we already do a pretty good job of capture, like at a formal engagement event, we'll capture the themes of what we've heard, but we don't always then fill out the second column that says this theme was heard, here's how it's going to inform the next part of our discussion or the decision itself, or it's not going to inform the next part, and here's why it's not going to inform the next part. Maybe it's something we don't have control over, or maybe it's something that would require a public-private partnership, and that exploration isn't feasible right now. Whatever the if not, why not is. And that's something that, boards could consider doing. If you wanted to report out on what you hear during public comment, you could capture those, and then in some sort of collaborative fashion with staff say, here's the next step for looking at that issue, or we're not going to look at this issue at this time because we looked at it last year and we encountered these barriers and they haven't changed yet. Something like that might be a little bit more fruitful. Those are the types of things that we can work with boards if you're interested in exploring. Some boards feel like that would be appropriate to their role. Other boards have told us they really feel like they need to be both, certainly in terms of input that could influence a decision they have to make, they have to be pretty conservative, and we want to respect those differences among boards. Yes, Kevin?
I'd kind of echo what Andrea said. Like, a lot of the time I feel like I want to engage in, if nothing else, at least some clarification. But, I mean, and we've been specifically told before not to engage in long conversations through email that we receive, which I think Alan's gone, but I wanted to say that to him when he said that today, but that's not a forum that I'm allowed to say, we're not allowed to have big email discussions with you. That's just not the way the board is designed to work. It would be great to have a way to have those conversations. I tend to do that through in-person meetings, but it's really hard to do that and schedule them ad hoc. So for me, that's my opinion, is that I would like more of a chance to have people feel heard by being able to have some way of responding.
Yeah.
I guess to sort of follow up a little bit my own question from a few minutes ago and also what's being said here, one of the things I struggle with is when someone makes a comment, and typically, 95 times out of 100 at least, we just go on to the next thing and you take from it what you will. A lot of comments are just sort of for your information here, and there's nothing in a sense to interact with. But sometimes the person is, clearly asking for something. And on the one hand, we don't want to, I think, interrupt the flow of public comment by having an extended discussion after each person. And you don't necessarily want to sort of put public comments in the sort of hierarchy where one person makes a comment and you say, great idea, let's spend 15 minutes discussing that, and someone else makes a comment and they're, you're just crickets. They feel like, gee, but recognizing those concerns, at the same time, I think we ought to be ourselves a little more flexible in sometimes being willing to just say, does staff have, sometimes this happens, but not much, to say, does staff have a quick response to the point that was just made, or even could you follow up with that separately? We don't have to take up time here. But also be willing to say, I think, when we get to matters from the board, I'd like to follow that up and have a discussion, but so that the person knows that's going to happen. It may not be for an hour, but they know that's going to happen. Well, that I think we, just amongst ourselves, ought to keep in mind, is there sort of a quick communication that can occur that won't interrupt the flow of the meeting too much,
Right.
that nonetheless might, react to what the point the person was making. But I think sometimes we do miss some opportunities to kind of quickly address something and make people feel like they're,
Yeah.
the point was actually heard and resolved.
So it's obviously an issue that's clearly linked also to meeting management issues, which I understand. One of the ways that we are handling this in a slightly different context is when people write to city council, so they email council with their perspective on something, we're doing on the staff side what I sort of consider a quick triage. Are they expressing a viewpoint that they intend to express to their elected officials, and we should just let that happen because it's an important way for them to communicate with their elected official? Are they asking a specific question that staff could answer very quickly? It's a fact-based question. Are they clearly seeking more context about a project, and can we figure out a way to provide that? And staff tries to get out of the way if it's in that first category of just expressing an opinion or perspective, which often is what happens here. But sometimes there is a question in there, and if we can answer it very quickly, why belabor that point in terms of council correspondence? Obviously, we don't have the same confines of you have a 3-hour meeting and you've got to get through these other issues, but I do think that, there's ripe conversation to be had on how to address that, and maybe a similar triage model would be helpful.
No, I like that.
Getting back to your question too, a specific example of something that I liked that I think could be modified and made a little bit better was in the North TSA process, they asked 1 to 2 of us to be at each of the public meetings that were not conducted here. And there was an issue because at one time 3 of us showed up and they were like, no, go away. And I think that was a really bad idea, that they should all be noticed so that we could all go. The second thing is, I think even though when I was there, I think there was a chance for me to introduce myself in the beginning, sometimes I felt like the creepy guy standing behind everybody watching them talk. It might be useful for us to get name tags for that. And then at the beginning to say, everyone who's there have opportunity to say, hey, look, I'm on the board and I'm here. If you want to come and like discuss anything about this with me individually tonight, I'm here. And that's part of the whole session, is whatever group interaction, but also if you want to bend my ear, that's totally fine. I think that would be a really great modification of what we did last time that might provide for a better sense of like, why is creepy Kevin standing behind everybody? Because I'm actually trying to understand like the thought process that's going on, and then the guy with the name tag, talk to him.
That's a really good suggestion. We've been grappling with that public notice question just this week on a couple of engagement events, and we are in that particular context, we decided to publicly notice them so that in case more people, more elected officials or boards and commission members show up, that we don't have to turn them away. A question I got from a council member, though, was, Sarah, do you really want me to go to these events? Because if I'm there, people may decide, oh, I'm going to go talk to this council member and try to influence the person rather than participating in whatever the collective group activity is. And I think we have to be mindful of that, and I think that falls to those of you who are there, that you're partially there as an observer role to watch the process and watch some of the magic that can happen when you've got people sitting around a table with different perspectives and they come to some conclusion together, as opposed to having one person who's particularly vocal corner you in the room. But then also, I think that the yearning for that two-way dialogue is really important too, and could happen in that forum.
And just to add to that, I know during the Ag Plan that very thing arose, where do we have 3 board members attending a meeting, and we actually, Mark Gershman and Cecil in our department, updated our policy on making sure it's publicly noticed so all the board members could attend. For instance, one of the Ag Plan meetings with the leasees, and that sort of solved that problem. So we have updated that policy. And I'm just curious tonight, going back to what you said earlier, Molly, for tracking time and stuff, would it be good for Sarah to come back at some point to when you've got all questions formed and she could have a chance to look at them and answer them, and then sort of bring the answers back to you if you've had a chance to sort of form other questions? Or would you like to just continue the discussion now?
Well, I feel like, tonight, I'm just speaking, as we go through the process of the process, I feel like a lot of questions will come out during that. And so I guess that was kind of why I said that in the beginning. It seems like something that could evolve. But everybody's points that they brought out, also, I think everybody feels that way. I certainly struggle with when people come and speak, what do we do next? Because, and that may be something that would be nice to get public input after this meeting. If the public is listening and really feels like they would like a different format, I'd like to hear that.
Okay. So this feedback already has been very helpful. I appreciate it. I'm going to stay here for the discussion on the process. And if there is I think the committee has a really good handle on how the proposed process aligns with what we're trying to do around engagement, but if there's a particular question that I can answer, I'm happy to do so. I'm also very happy if you want to think about areas you'd like to explore further in the future, trainings that you'd be most interested in. If I'm not the right person to do that training, we'll find someone who is. In some cases, I might be able to provide that training myself, and whatever I can do to be a resource to you in this area, I would like to be able to do. So if you wanted to communicate with staff, we have a very good relationship, and they'll let me know what you need.
Great.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Sarah. And we'll be seeing you more later. And we have 3 other staff updates. I'm going to ask the staff if you could possibly, given we're a bit behind in the agenda, be as brief as possible or be a little more concise. That'd be wonderful. And next we have Colin Leslie on the voice and sight dog leash requirement monitoring program.
All right, good evening. Colin Leslie, I'm the Human Mentions Coordinator with Open Space. So these are the results from the 2016 cycle of the voice and sight monitoring. The full report is in your packet, and it will be posted on our website tomorrow as well. So there's a lot in there, but I'm going to just cover some kind of high-level results. Just as a sort of quick refresher, the goals of the Voice and Sight tag program are to try and sort of increase awareness and adherence to the regulations that are currently there. That helps with visitor experiences and also resource conservation. The monitoring program itself is designed to evaluate compliance at a system-wide level, so it's not targeted to any specific area of the system. But voice and sight monitoring happens on voice and sight trails. Leash monitoring happens on leash required trails. So kind of a quick refresh of the timeline here. So the tag program was called for in the Visitor Master Plan back in 2005. It was sort of first implemented in 2006, which was the first monitoring program that existed. After sort of 3 cycles monitoring, it went into a program review period for a few years that included extensive public engagement with OSBT, and input from City Council. That led to some tag program enhancements implemented in 2015 and a new monitoring program, of which the results from this are the second cycle of that new monitoring program, which had a lot of modifications that to the protocol that were put in place through that public process. So I'm not going to read every one of these off, but there are a lot of particular components that go into this evaluation. So for voice and sight, that includes tag display as well as a number of behavioral components that we're also observing when we do data collection. And then there's the permanent and seasonally leash required trail data collection that's also part of this monitoring effort. The monitoring locations are spread, like I mentioned, all across the system. This is an overview of where we collected data in 2016. So won't read off all these numbers, but there were 61 voice and sight locations, about 29 permanent leash locations, and then 6 seasonal leash trails. And so that included a lot of observation sessions. Some of those areas got monitored. Any location was monitored between one observation session and several observation sessions. Those were about 3 hours each, so if you sort of do the quick math, there's a little over 600 hours of kind of total staff observation time that goes into this data set. Visitor parties, there's a specific definition in there, but a visitor party is basically a group of people and their dog or dogs that kind of appear to be one coherent group on the system. I thought it'd be helpful to have an overview of sort of the perspective that staff have when they're out at one of these monitoring locations. So this is a panorama of our South Boulder Creek monitoring location. Those white lines represent sort of the trail, which is hidden just below the vegetation. 2016 was a pretty good year, so we had a lot of vegetation out in the middle of it. So staff did not get to sit down. They had to stand up most of the time to see what was going on. So here's the general results for the 3 components. So voice and sight, this is looking at overall compliance, so that list of measures that I showed earlier. To be kind of fully compliant, a visitor party has to be compliant with each one of those measures. So positive display of the tag, as well as sort of no violations in any of the behaviors that were observed. There's a breakdown on the next slide of those specific components that go into voice and sight. Permanent leash trails, we had 76% compliance on permanent leash trails and a little bit lower on seasonal leash trails at 68%. So it ties into some of the later recommendations that we have in areas we see for possible modifications to the program. So here's a breakdown of the individual components for the voice and sight regulation. Tag display is 56%. Those of you who are savvy might notice that that's lower than 68%. There's a normalization process because a number of the observations we have, the observers aren't able to positively identify the presence of a tag. There's been a growing trend towards fixing the tag on the side of the collar, and unless the observer is able to see both sides of the dog, they can't confirm if the tag is or is not there. So that process is lined out in the report. For a lot of the behavior-based measures, though, we tend to see pretty high compliance rates. And so again, keeping in mind that these are on designated voice and sight trails, within sight, 98%, 99% for 2 dogs off leash. Voice control is kind of the lower component in there. Definitely some opportunities for improvement. Those numbers in the parentheses at the bottom of the list represent the number of visitor parties that went into calculating that percentage. So voice control, one of the caveats to it is we can only evaluate if the dog responds to the voice command if a voice command is issued. And in this case, those 27 also represent sort of explicit come or hear commands, which was an agreed upon recommendation in the previous public process. The report has sort of, if you throw in all commands, just the dog's name or something like that, compliance is actually a little higher, I think 74% if I remember correctly. No charging or chasing wildlife or livestock. We only had 4 potential opportunities during all of the observation. I think that's not enough to reliably calculate a percent. I think the takeaway from that is probably on voice and sight trails, designated trails, we just don't have that many opportunities for wildlife interaction. It is a bit of a challenge, though, because it leaves us in a position where we don't necessarily know what the outcome would be in a statistical sense when those occur. Again, we've got some recommendations about how we might address that in the future. So here they are. First recommendation is to increase, or it should probably really even say just continue outreach and education to non-participating dog guardians. So our largest source of non-compliance in the voice and sight component is lack of display of a voice and sight tag. And that's largely an administrative component. That could be awareness of the program. That could be participation in the program. The voice and sight, since the voice and sight enhancements were enacted, we still have pretty much full attendance of the courses. So that's probably reflective of both new people coming to the program as well as maybe people have participated in the previous version of the program, still getting back into it. So it's not like we started the program, many thousands of people went through the program. The classes still have a capacity of a little over 20 people. So there might be some lag time in kind of integrating everybody who wants to participate in the program through that class.
And so total participation in the program, how has that trended over the years and through the upgrade in the program?
So I need to touch base with our administrator for that and see if, as I was going through this, I realized there might be some opportunities in there to look at the trends in participation over time and try and correlate that, especially next year or this coming year when we do start the final plan cycle. I think one opportunity in there is to increase education in the voice and sight class regarding the purpose of permanent and seasonally leash required trails. So of the non-compliant visitor parties that we observed, there was roughly an equal proportion that both had tags and didn't have tags. So there is at least some opportunity for an audience that has gone through the voice and sight class to maybe receive a little bit more education and clarity on why those leash regulations exist in those locations. Some clarification and simplification of voice and sight regulation language on trail signs. They still, represent fairly small signs. Some maybe give the impression that it's a voice and sight trail first and that you have to participate in the program second. Lastly, developing some sample methods that can better account for the unequal distribution of wildlife across the system. So we know that a lot of our monitoring locations they certainly don't have any resident communities of wildlife, so we really wouldn't expect to see wildlife or livestock at those locations. As we get a better understanding of the distribution of wildlife, I think we can pair that to better design our sampling methods to look at wildlife encounters where we expect more wildlife to be.
Can you clarify, when you're talking about, are you including prairie dogs in that comment?
Yes.
Okay, because it just would have struck me, I understand that hoping that there might be a deer, and so you could test, how does the dog react to a deer is pretty much a chance phenomenon, but there's certainly trails where there's prairie dogs essentially abutting the trail and that are, reasonably popular with dogs, and you could get some sense of how often the dogs are chasing the prairie dogs. And
right. And in the 4 observations that we had, those all did involve prairie dog opportunities. Basically, 2 resulted in passes. The dogs didn't really show any interest, and 2 resulted in interactions. But the initial selection of the locations was not biased in any way towards locations that had wildlife. So if wildlife is an explicit interest, it might be worth it to first look at where wildlife is present on the system and then use that to design the sample more specifically. One last slide that I had in here, just to give you a heads up of sort of the next steps. So next year, we're going to be conducting the final planned monitoring cycle that was laid out in part of that public review process. It's going to occur from April to November next year. That's a slightly longer sample window. We're hoping we might pick up enough observations in some of these low frequency categories to get a little bit of better data in that last year. That'll also take us through both the grassland and bear closures, sort of the full seasonal closure cycle there. Once that's done, 2018, early 2019, we'd like to bring together an interdisciplinary review panel to look at all 3 years of data, figure out sort of the implications for all of our different management responsibilities. Part of that will be developing some tag program recommendations where we go after the conclusion of this next monitoring cycle. And then another point I wanted to mention, so 2019, this is sort of opportunistic timing or good timing here. 2019 begins the first of this 5-year required refresh course. So those people who have already participated in the program, beginning in 2019, they're going to need to come back to the class. So that's an opportunity to re-engage with them. If we want to do some curriculum update to the course, this will be an opportunity to reach those people who have already gone through the course again. So with that, 2 questions are basically, any questions or feedback about the 2016 monitoring results or the next upcoming 2018?
I have a simple question. I couldn't tell from your time periods what the earliest time of day and the latest time of day would be for your observations.
Sure. So the earliest time of day for most of the season is 7 a.m. to 8 a.m. We do it in full hour increments. Those shrink a little bit towards the end of the year. Basically, we try and have enough daylight that we can positively identify the tag, but it's basically sun up to sundown.
So the latest would be?
8 o'clock.
8, okay.
And also for staff safety out on system.
I had a comment and a question about in the next steps. It doesn't look like you stated that you haven't gotten anywhere that took more than an hour to get there. Yet some places like Royal Arch, there's problems with when you have a dog on leash, and the dog steps off of a big incline, takes the owner and the dog with them. So you see a lot of observations of people dropping the leashes and stuff just so they don't break a leg trying to do it. I'd like input. I've had some situations on some of those trails, and so I would very much like to see monitoring happen, if we could, to a further distance and on some of our higher trails that have seasonal requirements, especially because of the wildlife. And I have some other questions, but let's go ahead.
I'd like 2 quick comments. One is to follow up the wildlife point. It'd be fine with me and would make some sense to intentionally pick a trail 2 or 3, which are adjacent to a prairie dog colony. If that's going to mess up your data because it's not comparable with prior years, then, I can see why I don't do it. But if consistency with, trends over time, you were to intentionally and non-randomly pick some trails and say, okay, that's a good place where I'm going to get a lot of wildlife interaction opportunities. It seems to me what you lose in sort of the randomness of your selection is more than offset by the fact that you're getting a more rich data set of possible chances for dogs to, chase wildlife and see how they actually do. The other comment is, most of the data is at a sort of aggregate level, how we're doing across the system, which is, the most important metric. But there are some opportunities for us to learn about how we do in one situation relative to another. It's notable that we do better on trails that are permanently on leash than ones that are seasonal. I think you'd guess, of course, that you're going to get lower compliance with something that has changing rules over time. It's interesting to see the magnitude of that, but directionally, I think that's exactly what you'd expect. But I think it might be interesting to look at other metrics, particularly, for example, are we doing better on trails that, like to my mind, are sort of a neighborhood trail where you're getting repeat users, basically the same group over and over and over again, versus trails that are heavily sort of tourist trails and you get a lot of one or rare time visitors, and get a better sense of what's working and what isn't working, because I think that does inform, kind of what to do about it. You get a sense of where is compliance higher and where are the real drop-offs in compliance occurring.
Sure. I think with the pending results from our on-site visitor survey, which will give us a better sense of where those locations are that have higher percentages of sort of daily visitors, neighborhood visits versus, new or less frequent visitors, would be a good basis to look at opportunities for designing a sample that could look at that.
Thanks.
So I'd kind of like to echo and modify kind of what Tom just said about the wildlife. So the statistician in my head heard move study points, and I had like a little migraine explode, because that would be like a really, really bad idea for the validity of a study to move the points. That being said, I think a separate study that looks at this, that's separate from this other question, might be really helpful for our understanding to see what happens in our open space when dogs and wildlife are interacting. Certainly 4 interactions out of 100 or whatever it was is, I wouldn't, my statistician brain also has a migraine with that. So that's also not really good, but it'd be helpful to know. And then I did have a question, a sort of clarifying question. All the things that you noted in the survey, sans one, seemed like something that, someone, for lack of a better word, could be standing, sitting, looking sideways and sort of tally, oh, I saw this dog has a tag or whatever. But then the one question about voice control, where you were saying whether or not the dog came when you said come or something, I'm not clear. Is that just you happened to notice that they said come and the dog didn't come, or did you say step out from the bushes and go, please call your dog, and then they did that? Because I just didn't know. That sounds like they might just not have chosen to call their dog. Or
Sure. So we record both the behaviors of the party under observation, which we do by a focal sampling method. So we observe throughout the entire observation zone, we observe one visitor party the whole time. And that's so that we can see the sort of less overt behaviors, and including watching for instances and then listening for voice commands issued by that visitor party. I think one limitation from, or one potential limitation with the voice and sight recall is that there may be opportunities where the guardian should have maybe issued a voice command but didn't. That if it's sort of a significant enough incident, then that will get captured by the behavioral response of whatever the dog is interacting with, which is taken into consideration when evaluating the compliance. So it doesn't work perfectly that it's, wasn't compliant because a voice command should have been issued, but it might be compliant or non-compliant based on really the severity of sort of what the dog was engaging in and what the response from the receiving party was. If that makes sense.
It helps. Thanks.
So I noticed that one of your 2018 monitoring recommendations is to help with the definitive tag presence identification, better optics, better training and whatnot. So I understand that the sampling protocol is very much don't interact with the parties, but I wonder if you could introduce a second observer further down the trail that after you've done your at a distance observation says, can I see your dog's tag? Not as an enforcement action, but just as a way to possibly create a scaling factor on these observations so that you can see the tag rather than having to try and get better binoculars.
Sure. Yeah, I think in this case, whether or not that modification is put in place for this cycle, I think definitely sort of a setback observation point is the least optimal method for determining something like tag presence, which is probably much better determined by staff location, more adjacent to the trail. And if I were to have some takeaways from the data, it would be that that's clearly a component that needs some better understanding. There are some components which are easily quantifiable from a distance, and I think what we're finding is that there are some that are much more difficult to quantify accurately from or as precisely as we'd like from a distance.
Okay.
Do I assume that after the 18 monitoring cycle, there'll be sort of a comprehensive report back to council then? And that would cover not just the monitoring program, but trends in citizen complaints and survey responses and citation numbers and things like that? Does that all get folded into?
Yeah, some of that, it's not all of those are specific requirements, but there are additional data sets that we will likely be including in the 2018, including a lot of the ones that you mentioned. Okay. There was some compliance or, citation, there was some citation analysis that was done in the 2014 report. Those were really kind of low numbers compared to the overall numbers of dog visits that we get, but we will go back and be revisiting that. Especially in some of these early years, there was definitely an effort to try and educate those that there was this new program in place and needed some participation, but we'll go back and look at those numbers for 2018.
Okay, thanks.
I had a question about, you mentioned that there was going to be an increase in education to the public in the next steps. What beyond what we've done do you plan to include?
So those were sort of the recommended takeaways from the data. We haven't put them all into actionable items by any means yet. Those will need to sit down and across the various teams that are responsible or groups that are responsible for managing the Voice and Sight program as to what opportunities there are for modifying that education or enhancing that. So sort of the short answer is there's no concrete steps at the moment, but that will be sort of the recommendation process that comes out of the larger review team next year.
So kind of tagging on what Tom talked about, I want to put a pretty strong lens on making sure that the wildlife monitoring is really complete. Because that was a big problem on the agricultural lands, with both prairie dogs, but especially cattle, with dogs, injuring cattle. So I think it'd be important to include that, kind of do a robust study on that as opposed to the 4. Other questions? Thanks so much, Colin.
Thank you.
Thank you, Colin. Next up is Don D'Amico, and I do recognize we're behind schedule.
Yeah.
We like to talk.
Oh, no, well,
Okay.
yeah, perfect. We'll schedule it a little bit better next time. So Don D'Amico, a brief update on the groundwater study.
Yes.
South Boulder Creek.
Brief. I'll talk fast. Included in your packet is a memo describing some work that's going to occur on open space along South Boulder Creek, upstream and downstream of US 36. And this is part of the South Boulder Creek flood mitigation project. There'll be some contractors out there doing some land surveying and installing groundwater monitoring wells as part of the design process to get more information on groundwater conditions in the area. We've been working with Kurt Bauer, the engineering project manager with utilities, and their contractor to work with them to make sure that their activities have minimal impacts on open space. And our real estate group is currently drafting a temporary license agreement that has terms and conditions that will hopefully address some of those things like defined access routes and best management practices and material handling requirements. So this map shows the study area and the approximate well locations. To orient you, I don't have a pointer, but that diagonal line through the middle is US 36. The blue line, thin line running north and south is South Boulder Creek, and then the lighter color area where you see the white and the yellow circles is the CU South property. Open space is shown in green. The red squares are the approximate locations of the monitoring wells, and the yellow and white dots are either test pits or boreholes, which there won't be any of on open space. We'll only have monitoring wells on open space. There will be about up to 17 monitoring wells installed, and next week we'll be going out, open space staff will be going out to define those access routes, identify the exact locations of the monitoring wells to avoid work in wetlands and Ladies Trust's orchid habitat and other sensitive areas. Interestingly, in the early 90s, there were some monitoring wells installed as part of a groundwater study to investigate hydrologic conditions for spiranthes, for Ladies Trust's orchid. And those wells were installed north of the highway. About, I think, 6 of them were installed, and hopefully we'll be able to use those as part of this study and avoid any wells and associated activity between South Boulder Road and US 36. So the contractor will be using equipment that we've specified, including a relatively small drill rig, kind of a mobile unit like this. It's meant for use in places where there's either high groundwater, kind of muddy conditions. They have big flotation tires, relatively lightweight, and they won't be using any chemicals or any drilling fluids, except for water to lubricate the boreholes. They'll be collecting that water in any material that comes out of the boreholes and hauling that off-site. This is a picture showing what a monitoring well looks like when it's installed. Disregard the disturbed earth around there. That little white circle, these wells will be flush mounted, with the ground surface. They'll be covered by a small, about an 8-inch manhole type cover that will then be sealed around the edges with a thin ring of concrete. So the total area that the well will occupy, the surface area, is about a 16 or maybe 18-inch diameter circle. So we're going to start the surveying work this week. That should take up to 2 weeks. And then they'll be beginning the groundwater monitoring well installation work in mid-January, and that's expected to take 4 to 6 weeks, depending on weather and conditions that they encounter when they start drilling. Some signs will be installed along South Boulder Creek, letting folks know what's going on there. There will also be a press release. Council got a heads up, I believe, last Friday, informing them about the project. So we're trying to do as much outreach as possible. And in the end, hopefully we'll have some pretty good groundwater data, and data that we'll be able to, open space will be able to use. We'll also be able to use these wells in the future to monitor groundwater conditions in an area with a lot of resource values and some pretty valuable resources, wetlands, Spiranthes habitat, tall grass, and things like that. So that's a brief update. Be happy to answer any questions.
Yeah, what's the expected lifetime of these monitoring wells?
Well, really indefinitely. Okay. The wells that I mentioned as part of the ORCID study were installed in '91, and they're still there. Yeah. We need to make sure that they're clean and functioning, but sometimes it's just a matter of flushing the wells out and making sure they're actually measuring groundwater.
Yeah. Okay.
Do these, particularly the new wells, do they have telemetry, or is somebody going to have to go out and?
Yeah, that's a good point. They'll be fitted with data loggers with pressure transducers to actually just remotely measure the data. It won't be real-time data. It'll have to be recovered over, as the study goes on. I don't know whether they're going to monitor them monthly and download the data, but it won't be telemetry.
And are you going to get all that data too?
Eventually, yes. We'll get the data as probably at the end of the study. They're going to be monitoring the wells for about a year. So toward the end of the study, we'll certainly work with utilities and the contractor to get the data to have in our database.
Well, that's a lot of data equipment on the system.
Yeah, it is. And like I said, we've tried to minimize the impacts. We've specified they typically have a bigger drill rig, they have a service truck, they have a engineer's pickup, they have an ATV, they have a backhoe, and so we've tried to minimize. We said, well, the engineer can ride with the, with somebody else. So we've limited it to a drill rig, a backhoe to haul the water and spoils in and out with. Hopefully those trips will be minimum. And then a UTV to haul staff in and out of with a little bit of equipment in the back. So we won't have any service trucks or pickups. We won't have a big dual axle drill rig like you typically see.
And are we limited in time or to do this? In other words, if it's really, really rainy and we've got a lot of tear up potential, can we delay things?
Yeah, that'll be one of the things that we address in the license agreement, and we've done that in the past where we've said the ground has to be either dry or frozen in order for vehicles to access the property. We'll be working with them really closely as they go out there to make sure that the conditions are being met, but also as things come up, we'll be able to answer questions and direct them to the appropriate place.
Thank you.
Sure, thank you.
Really helpful. And the last update is from Bo Clark on the High Plains Volunteer Project.
Howdy, good evening. Bo Clark, Trails Volunteer Program Lead. with OSMP. I'm going to be very brief and picture heavy with you guys. Just wanted to bring to your attention the completion of High Plains Trail realignment, and with that, the National Public Lands Day of 2017 we did this year. So just a brief backstory on the condition of the trail before we began. It's about a 1,500 linear foot section of trail that you can see is double, triple, and sometimes even more tracked out. The trail ran at steep grades. It had no drainage, that being water bars, rolling grade dips, or the best, which is grade reversals. Since 2014, trails staff has been ticking away with groups like Boulder Mountain Bike Alliance, since this is a very mountain bike friendly trail, to try and fix this in place with surfacing material or adding structures to try to stabilize the trail tread, to no avail. Every year we'd come back and there'd be a new braid on the side of those structures. And so we were really encouraged by community partners like Boulder Mountain Bike Alliance to explore other options for a sustainable realignment of that trail, but being very conscious of it being adjacent to an HCA, or prairie dog habitat, rare plant monitoring sites. So huge kudos to ecological staff to work alongside with trails, because we pulled this off in less than 4 months, which is a pretty quick turnaround from boots on the ground, looking at a bare hillside and what to do, to pulling our trucks out and completing the project. Just quickly, before and after shot of what the original trail alignment was. Without topo lines, I apologize for that. It's hard to see that the original trail is running at too steep of a grade. It does follow a contour. You can see that kind of dog leg there. But if you look at the new section, that nice squiggly line to a trail designer is a pretty cool thing. And it just shows you can actually see those grade reversals in there where we've, through the design process, have been very sort of hands-on with how we wanted to shed water from the trail. So how'd we get this done? Well, we decided let's work with BMA and let's get as many volunteers as we can, because another component of sustainability is fiscal sustainability too. So how can we do this and involve the community and knock out work with more resources than just our paid staff? The cool thing is that we had a lot of youth on this project. Boulder mountain bike team, or Boulder High School mountain bike team, and Fairview mountain bike team came out with huge numbers. We got the kids involved, families, moms and dads. It was really, really cool. All in all, that day we had 51 volunteers. We put in over 350 hours. And we had a Dannon corporate food company came out another day for the restoration effort, and BMA came out a day before National Public Lands Day to prep. So in total, we did over 420 hours of volunteering, which is more than a couple weeks of crew time, and got the trail done. So just a couple pictures. OSMP staff, we did the heavy lifting of getting the machinery out and getting a rough cut in, but it was all the volunteers who did all the heavy lifting, transported 25 tons of soil for restoration purposes, and we surfaced small sections of trail that were very flat. Left to right, flag line, construction, finished product. You can see the grade reversals in there. We think that this is going to hold up much better over time. One way to get from the top of the hill to the bottom of the hill, we did have to push grade in one area about 20 feet, so we armored that out with stone. And it was a great way for volunteers to get involved and do some technical work that we hope to continue in the future. This is a great training opportunity for not just Boulder Mountain Bike Alliance, but any of our volunteers. We're looking to accomplish more of our work plan with volunteers, because we know that this community is really engaged with that. Some other shots of the youth involved. They had a great time. The kids even remarked that, and their coach said, hey, this is going to be on our new training ride. We love this trail. Another before and after shot, just being a little bit more playful with the landscape too. That was really important to how we wanted to work with BMA, was to use the landscape to create a sustainable trail, but also to try a few new things that we haven't been doing in the past that are a little bit more playful, whether you're on a bike, a horse, or on foot. And lastly, that nice shot of a straight line versus what we've created further up on the hillside, better cross slopes, better trail alignment. We're not going to have triple track to consistently try to maintain every year and keep getting toward it. So that's all I have. It's my first time.
Thank you.
Any questions?
Well, I wanted to say thank you for this realignment. I used to build a lot of trail with OSMP back in the day, and I was one of the builders of the original High Plains Trail. And when we were putting it in, it was like, oh, man.
You just knew, though.
You just knew it was going to braid like this, and just because of the grade and the sight lines and stuff. And so it was like, it's really exciting to see we learn from, I wouldn't say the mistakes of the past, but we learn from how the trail is responding to the terrain and are open to doing something different. So thank you.
Cool, thanks.
Yeah.
Great job.
Thanks.
Yeah.
It was fun.
Yeah, shout out to the staff, really collaborated across the department in support of getting this to the volunteer project. So kudos to the staff.
Absolutely, yeah.
And Bo really led that, so kudos to you too. And thanks to all the volunteers in the community.
Yeah.
And thanks to all the staff who abbreviated their presentations.
You're welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Oh. I was just going to say thanks a lot. I've had a lot of public comment that this new section's wonderful, so I hope there's more to come.
I'd like them to work on getting some precipitation to test the grade reversal.
Oh,
Tonight, 1 to 3 inches in theory.
Just one final matter from the staff. It's a friendly matter. I think you've got a handout on your podium tonight. And on Sunday, we'll be having Jeff and Paige do a family-friendly holiday special up at the amphitheater on Flagstaff. So we're hoping the board might be able to attend. You might need to bring a blanket. You might need to bring a bathing suit, depending upon the weather. But we hope we'll see you there. It'll be great.
That sounds great.
Okay.
Okay, so do we have any matters from the board besides the council retreat input?
Go ahead, Tom.
I was just going to suggest, I don't know that we need to discuss, we certainly could, that maybe it's really an issue for the agenda for Molly and staff to discuss whether to agree to Historic Boulder's request. Happy to give input, but I mean, often those are perfectly happy to leave in your hands.
so we'll follow up with Historic Boulder and understand what the agenda item is and what the content is, what they're asking for, and then I'll work with Molly on scheduling.
Set that up. Did you have something, Kevin?
So I just wanted to update the board and the public as well. I heard back from Jim Reeder about the Eagle Trail, and it appears we've still not been able to find a solution. So I'm still pretty disappointed because it hasn't come up as an official matter for our board yet, and I would actually like to officially ask that it be come up next time as something about how we're going to address this. I specifically requested, because the Cobalt Trail is supposed to have some sort of minor realignment and then to be open as a multi-use trail. I specifically asked if that needed to happen in that order or the other order, and Jim said it could happen in either order to the best of his knowledge. So I said, could you open the Cobalt Trail? And he said, well, we'd have to engage in some other really big process, et cetera, et cetera. I guess he talked with several of the trail people about rerouting the Eagle Trail, which is also on the plan for the North TSA, but also said that's way off on the horizon. So I would just like to ask that this come up to have a more formal discussion for the whole board to understand why we can't move forward with some sort of safety-focused opening or rerouting of a trail and prioritize that above other things. Because this is a safety issue, not a fun issue.
In the solution you're looking for, you said rerouting, so you don't think this is something that's just a pure safety question can be solved by signage that says
No.
danger.
So I
You're
think
about to go down a steep, difficult technical.
I think the challenge is that you're putting a very steep and very slippery, loose road in the middle of a lot of beginner riding or hiking experience. And a danger sign does not solve a problem like that because it's not an issue of going too fast. It's an issue of people not being able to be stable on a loose terrain that's at a far too steep a grade to be sustainable. So I don't see a sign as being something that would help, having seen the effect of signs in dangerous areas. Otherwise, I think that what you end up with is people who think they're okay, or that there's a patch of ice that's not known that's there, and that changes the conditions. Given the Cobalt Trail is already at a pretty sustainable grade, it's got really good visibility, so the likelihood of user conflict is low, and it's designated in the North TSA as to be something that should be open to bicycles. I think that that's a good short-term solution, and then to do whatever rerouting needs to be done for both of the trails in the long term would be an even better long-term solution. But if this was a case of people riding too fast or not paying attention, I think it's a different scenario where a sign might help, but this is a case of people who are beginners not knowing what's ahead of them, and even with a sign, I'm not aware that that would solve the problem. If this wasn't something that was scheduled to be opened and rerouted, I would say, okay, well, this is a different kind of problem, but it is scheduled to be open and rerouted. So I'm just requesting that we get some sort of better, more in-depth explanation at some time in the future, because it's come up, it's been like something that's on my personal agenda, and I've brought up, I think this is the 6th time for this board. It has never been an agenda item that's been addressed by staff to this board. So I'm asking for that now.
We can, I'll work with Molly on scheduling a discussion. We'll bring options for your consideration.
Thank you.
I had one, it's more of a comment, but I just wanted to put out to the board. I was going to say this to y'all in the meeting, but I felt like it was better to say to the board. Is there a way when we do the written reports, like, for instance, the written report on the recovery from the damage, to me is really something I'd love to see a presentation about. So is there a way to maybe highlight, do you all feel like it's important to highlight these more in the meetings rather than just the written report? I mean, it's great to have the written report, but there's been a couple of these that have come up, and I thought, it would be great to know a little bit more in depth and see some visuals and things,
Yeah, absolutely, Molly. I think, as you know, we put the written report in as a way to help with agenda management.
Right.
But we're very happy. If there's anything there, could you bring that back as a presentation? Yeah, of course we can do that.
Okay.
So just let us know.
And I would say I also have questions on that very interesting report, so I would love to get it on the agenda when you can.
For us, it's a nice way to provide you with an abbreviated matter, and then if you need more details or explanations or information, just let us know and we'll happily bring it back.
So maybe we could ask generally, if people had questions about the written report, we could do a presentation the following month.
Yeah.
Okay, that'd be great.
Just one more thing. I just want to say really quickly, even though I haven't been able to find resolution with Jim Reeder, I think he's really been working very hard on many things, including taking the time to address this with me, and I'm very appreciative. I realize it might have sounded like I hate this guy, but I think he's been wonderful, and I really appreciate the time. I just wish we had come to a better resolution so far.
So now we need to do input for council retreat. And I think what we had decided was to come bring our comments and so I don't know who wants to start, but I will certainly happy to start with one of the obvious things, which would be the overarching issues to finally get that, I mean, now that we're into the master plan, I think the time is nigh, rather than keep kicking that can down the road, I think, to really look at it, the overarching issues would be top on my list. And I'll open it up to other people.
Do you want to go through your list?
No, we'll go through the group.
My thinking is simple, that if I was laying out things I'd like council to look at, the core of them have to be the decisions we're asking them to make on the master plan. And so my inclination would be to say, boy, if you can do that, which includes the overarching issues, by the way, that would be great. And I wouldn't add a whole lot to that because I'd love to make sure they can focus on that.
Yes, I would second that. I'm not exactly sure how, it's a little tricky to frame this in the way that we're answering the question, but I think I would say if council can attend to the master plan issues in the way that the process committee is asking of them, that I would not, at this point, ask anything more of them on open space issues. Inevitably, things come up in the course of the year, but at least in terms of long-range planning, my own vote would be that that's all we're asking of them, which is, it's a big ask, but that's not asking more than that.
Mm-hmm. I'm in full agreement.
Okay. Kevin?
So I had one that's sort of overarching, and it's actually kind of dirty pool because it's a question they keep asking us. They keep saying, what do we do about sustainability, carrying capacity, number of people? And I've really thought about this in the last year, and this is not a science position. This is a policy thing that I think it would be helpful to have them be aware. We're going to get to 10 million user visits a year soon. What do you want to do? And I don't think that's a question for staff or the board as much as council and the public to answer, because I think that's a big overarching question, because that's going to determine how management, and for that matter, this master plan goes forward. And I think that's a great thing for them to kick around some more.
And it is one of the overarching issues that's
Right.
been out there for quite a while.
It seems like they keep asking us, and I think we're not the right people to answer that. To answer how to make it work, that might be us. To answer what it should be, I think that needs to be a bigger question for the city, because we start asking questions about, do we limit the number of people? Do we go bonkers making trails? Do we just accept that there's going to be a solid line of people on every trail because there's not enough space? Those are big questions for elected people and the public to choose. That's my thinking.
And I agree with Tom. I mean, I think, certainly the master plan process is huge. I would like to ask council, since they have more community input from the whole broader community and outlying communities, is there input from them on groups that we might not be reaching? Can they give us other input? Because, we're reaching to planning and other things, but I feel like there might be groups that we have not touched. And so I'd like input from them on that.
Just on that, the process committee has been spending and will be spending a good bit of time on exactly that question, and are getting considerable input from the two council members on the committee. So hopefully that is, in good hands, but certainly it's something we are actively attending to.
And I guess I would say that, Kevin, your comment would really be in the master plan process as population increases on the Front Range. I think a lot of the land management agencies are seeing this, the impact of visitation. And so that is an overarching question that a master plan looks at.
Okay.
And we actually just heard, as Tom said at the process committee, about doing an inventory of groups that we haven't reached in the past and that we'd like to make special efforts to reach out to. And what we're hearing from Sarah Huntley is that this work that we're doing will benefit the whole city, that other processes will be able to build on this inventory and these new avenues of reaching people we haven't reached before.
Is there any way that council does a subcommittee of council for something like overarching, besides our process subcommittee? Just because, as long as I've been on the board, which is now 5 years, it is that overarching, it's come up. It's been an overarching issue. And so if there was any way that we made sure that it really got taken care of, that'd be great. Others?
Well, I guess there's a question of the form and what is it that we're actually sending to council? We've been given 3 questions. I think I can't tell whether we've done anything more than just sort of craft what would be a 1 or 2 paragraph statement, which may be all that we wish to do, but we have until Friday to somehow get that into a form, whether it's to ask somebody to write it up, or we don't have another meeting between now and then, but there are.
And Tracy said a letter.
A letter from the board would be fine, and I bet council would love it if it were a couple of paragraphs.
Yeah.
Because they get a lot of input for the retreat.
Okay.
So, do we want to?
I think we should ask staff to consolidate our thoughts.
We could take a stab at that, yes. And do you want me to run it by Molly as your representative?
Yeah. Sure, why not?
Okay.
Okay.
But would it be good to send it out to the board?
Yeah, and we have a fallback if necessary for you to take it up at your January meeting. But if you're fine with it, we could just send it on.
Can I propose maybe if you send it out to us, and I know we can't vote on it because it wouldn't be a meeting, but if someone wants to veto it and say like, I don't want this, then we could do it in the January meeting. So then we're not technically voting or having a public meeting, but we're saying, okay, you send it to us first, and then we'll just say, if no one chimes in and says, this is horrible, then we go forward with it as it is. Does that seem, I feel like that doesn't violate.
Another thought is I could just send it out and get some feedback, and if it's like, change this word, grammar's wrong, your punctuation, things like that. If it's really not significantly different in content, I can just assemble it and then send it.
I think that sounds great. I mean, my concern is just not violating daylight laws, but at the same time making sure like, oh yeah, sure, go ahead and send that. And then, in the thing, Kevin is an idiot. And then, that's an official word to the city council.
They already know.
Expecting us to veto that statement?
But that's why I get veto power over at least that part.
Okay.
All right, well.
All right. Moving onward to the process.
Oh, yes.
Through the process, to the process.
Through the process to the process.
Yay, process.
Don't do that, man.
Leah, can you hit Control L?
Sure.
Okay, I'll introduce the kickoff for the master plan process tonight. We are actually asking for the board to make a recommendation to approve the master plan process and engagement effort when it goes to City Council. The first thing I'd like to do is actually introduce the team he'll be working with over the next 2 years. I'll be sponsoring the project. We joke about whatever that means. Probably means you get the blame if it goes wrong. We're not sure. But anyway, hopefully I'll be able to provide some guidance. The main lead on the project, though, will be Darren Wegner. We're really happy to have Darren on board leading this effort. She's got great experience with the city and previously with the National Park Service, and we think will make an excellent project manager. Supporting Darren will be Brian Aniger. I'm not sure if Brian's here tonight. You know Brian is our Chief Science Officer, so he'll bring that excellent expertise, technical knowledge to the effort. We'll also have Kerry Connold, our Community Relations Officer, focused on engagement. We've got in the front row Mark Gershman, who brings 160 years of experience to the effort. No, Mark is that sort of institutional knowledge and policy guidance as we go through this. And so with...
You're welcome.
I know. And so with that in mind, we're pretty hopeful that this sort of core team will be the sort of team you work with. And obviously, as Tracy, as director, will be like the final approval review for staff before it comes to you. And therefore, please feel free to contact that team anytime over the next 2 years. As project manager, I always say you have to CC Darren, and then she's able to coordinate everything. But hopefully that will make for a successful process. I would add we do have, from the staff perspective, an extended team, which is a staff member from each work group, to lend extra expertise as needed as we go through this process. The only other thing I wanted to mention before I pass it over to Darren tonight is, we have been asked, why do the plan? And if you notice on the project management plan on the second page, we actually say, why do we need an OSMP master plan? And I think it's really important how we mention we're in our 50th year. And it's interesting to me that the 50th year hasn't been a commiseration, it's really been a celebration. And what I mean by that is there's been excellent stewardship and really good guidance from the community and the board and council to help us as stewards. The community own the land, and we respond to their guidance, and you as the board member representing that. And I was actually with Oak Thorn last night, one of the founders. I was lucky enough to spend some time with them. And we say we've never done a master plan, but in truth, if you look at the founders' documents, they've got focus areas, they've got strategies, they set up an acquisition policy, we ended up with a city charter for open space. In essence, they did a master plan, and that guided us for the last 50 years. It would be nice to say, why are we doing the plan now? Can we set up that same level of effort and focus and thoughtfulness and community collaboration and guidance so that in 50 years we might have a similar celebration? And I think that's something to help guide us as we go through this. So I think we're all excited to get going on it. We've probably waited long enough on the process. We now want to get into the content. And with that, I'll pass you over to Darren to describe how we'll do that.
Thank you, Mark. And one of the things I also just wanted to add is that we've recently added a member to our core team, and that's Juliette Bonnell in the audience as well. And she will be acting as our deputy project manager. It's not typical that we have a PM and a deputy PM, but because it's a big project, we felt like it was necessary, and we're grateful to have Juliette on the team as well. So to build on what Mark was mentioning, just to reiterate this in yet another way, as we look at the purpose of the master plan, one of the things we can't forget is that we actually are required to do a master plan by the Boulder Valley Comprehensive Plan and city plans and policies that state that every department will do a master plan. And so it is something that we have to do procedurally. But more than that, back to the sort of romance of it and the meaning behind that, is that we are looking at, as we think about those next 50 years, about what the future of open space should look like and what should we focus on. What are those focus areas that really need to hone in on how we can best fulfill the charter purposes into the future? And then how do we connect those past plans that we have into a unified set of strategies across the system and help connect those dots? So this is a diagram that is just a different iteration on the one that's in the project management plan, just a simplified version to show you that what we're trying to do throughout the process is have a rhythm of windows of engagement where we're doing a heavy amount of listening and sharing, alternated with periods where we need to then do some integration and staff work where we aren't doing that level of engagement. And so we're trying, again, to have that nice rhythm where we would start pending council approval of this process in early 2018, and use that feedback in that first phase to develop our focus areas. And we are hoping that by the middle of next year, when we're talking about those focus areas, that we can have confirmation from the full board and city council at that time that those are in fact our focus areas, so that from there we can hold more listening and sharing opportunities and develop sets of strategies and priorities that really set us up for a successful master plan. To emphasize what those windows of engagement mean, I know we've talked about it a little bit here and there, and certainly did at the board study session as well. But just to be clear for all of us, what that means is that it really is an opportunity to be transparent about when we say, okay, we're ready to accept public comment, and when we have to say, okay, that comment deadline is approaching, because we then have to integrate and accept those comments. And so it is a slightly different approach to engagement than in the past, and it's something that is in alignment with the recommendations that came out of the PPWG that Sarah Huntley mentioned earlier. And so it's an opportunity to pilot that, and it's something that we'll certainly learn from as we go. And the other opportunity here is to use our process committee members to help us evaluate at each stage how well things went. And so that's another way that we'll integrate and adjust as needed. So just to reiterate the various strategies that we'll use going forward in the engagement process, the beginning of the process will look different than the end of the process. And what I mean by that is that the first phase of asking about our community's values, hopes, and fears about the future is much more about building relationships, enhancing relationships, Molly, to your point about reaching groups we haven't in the past, for example, and inviting that engagement into the process in ways we haven't, and doing that through a series of short duration but meaningful engagements, as well as a series of kickoff listening events. Later in the process, and once we have those focus areas, those are complex ideas that we need to work through. If you think about those overarching issues, for example, those are things that we need to have more focused thought and engagement around. And so the nature of engagement becomes more about focused meetings around perhaps those focus areas, concentrated engagement, and then eventually we'd like to do a scientific survey to confirm the community's priorities. So to illustrate this just a little bit more, when we think about that first engagement window, when we're asking about the values, hopes, and fears about the future, that's an opportunity to leverage the great work that, for example, our education outreach and volunteer staff do already, and use that as a way to find people at trails, trailheads, and even summits, to leverage the great programming that we're already doing through educational hikes or volunteer projects. Reaching housing communities through programming that we already have, for example, with through Boulder Housing Partners and I Have a Dream Foundation. Working with Growing Up Boulder, who's a partner through University of Colorado, to reach young kids and families at parks, soccer games, schools, libraries, senior centers even, and finding opportunities to have presence at festivals and community events. In terms of the sharing part of that rhythm that we're setting up, again, we're sort of seeing each window as an opportunity to both listen and share information. That for this first phase, it's really important that we start the conversation with the community around the system overview report. And so what I've highlighted here is that the last time we spoke to you at the study session, we talked mostly about how that system overview report was focusing on current conditions. And we heard from you a desire to see more of a hybrid approach where we do introduce the idea of future trends, sort of where we're heading, to help further define the issue, the problem, or the sets of opportunities that helps further explain why we're doing the master plan. And so the recommendation that came from our consultant was to add a chapter into the end of the system overview report, where we then talk more directly about those future trends and align those with the city charter so that we're effectively answering that question, how will these future trends affect our ability to deliver on the city charter? And so with that then, we're also hoping to highlight some of the key management approaches that are currently helping us address those issues, so that that then becomes sort of a platform to launch into as we build the community conversation in that first phase and beyond then also. And so that's certainly a change to the structure and content of that report that we're very grateful to have gotten your feedback on, so that we feel have a much better product coming forward, and that'll better support the conversation around focus areas and strategies in the master plan. So you saw a list a little bit like this at the study session as well, but just to give you an indication of some of the topics or the related policy questions that could emerge in this final chapter. This is a list of things that we as staff have been curious about as land managers. We certainly have wondered about these things over the last 50, 100 years. But that is only the beginning, and it's really only a way to set up the conversation. It's by no means meant to be the final set of topics that the master plan would engage around. It's a way, again, to begin that conversation. And so that could range from things around ecological health in a growing region to accessibility, financial health with changing sales tax revenues, et cetera. And so just wanted to give you a sense of that. As it relates to future engagement windows, as I mentioned, the nature of those are different than the first phase. And although what's still important at that time is this approach around equity and inclusion. And so what we mean by that is that at all stages, there are going to be opportunities for everyone to engage. And that's something that we want to make sure that that's clear. At later stages, once we have those focus areas, though, we will have specific topics or those specific focus areas to engage around. And so if you're interested in, say, 2 out of the 5 we may end up with, you can select that and be a part of those particular engagements. As we think about inclusion, we were also looking at opportunities to engage youth leaders and liaisons with the Latinx community to make sure that we're bringing those voices, say, into those formats in ways that feel inclusive and meaningful so that it is a realistic and appropriate set of strategies that comes out. It's also an opportunity to invite in some technical experts or members of the community who have particular interests around those focus areas or those particular themes and topics. And then again, to bring in sort of a scientific perspective from the scientifically valid survey that we would want to initiate towards the end of the process to confirm the strategies and priorities from our community. So as far as the types of strategies that might emerge from this process, we imagine them falling into 2 major categories, and those being the types that may suggest we need to update any existing plans that we have, or perhaps engage in new planning and design efforts that we haven't in the past. And so the master plan will certainly be an opportunity to give future guidance to changes in our current planning framework that need to be made to bring those up into alignment and compliance with what we come up with in the master plan. The other set of strategies might look more like they're providing us policy direction on the more specific services, programs, and projects that we provide on the ground. And so those are a slightly different kind of strategy that we would end up with. Now, in all cases, though, we have to make sure that this is a fiscally constrained plan, and that's something that's also different from what we've done in the past. And so we'll come up with financial scenarios to do that, where we're looking at expected revenues, slightly more than expected, and then perhaps unlimited funding. As far as making that final decision, obviously public comment and review are very important throughout the process, and once we've received that, we would then go to the planning board, as I believe I've mentioned before. Because this is a master plan, we need to make sure it's in alignment with the Boulder Valley Comprehensive Plan and the larger citywide capital improvement program. We would then bring it to the Open Space Board of Trustees and ask that you recommend the approval, that council approve the final plan, and then take that final plan to council for the final decision. Now, once the master plan is approved by council, then we have an opportunity to do what we're calling an implementation plan. And what we mean by that is it's how we're going to implement the master plan. It should not be confused with any of our other plans that we currently have, for example, around our grassland plan, our forest plan, our visitor master plan. This is, in particular, just how we're going to roll out the master plan itself. So again, after the master plan is approved is the time that we could add in more detail. And so what I mean by that is this is an example on the screen of the implementation plan from the transportation master plan. And so what was in the master plan itself was transportation demand management as an example focus area. And then the related strategy underneath that focus area was increase access to the EcoPass. And so that's effectively where the master plan held off in terms of the level of detail. But then afterwards, they built out this implementation plan where you're able to describe in more detail what that means, the potential partners that you might be able to engage to make that happen, and the more specific time frame within which you'll do that. So the next, say, 2 to 3 years versus 4 to 5 versus beyond. So we'll look at more of those short, mid, and long-term actions in more detail after the master plan is approved. So in terms of steps for early 18, just to give you a little bit more detail than is in the project management plan, our intention is to provide information to City Council on January 4th, and that they then take action to support the process as identified in the project management plan on January 16th. And that pending that, shortly thereafter, we would want to open that first engagement window, primarily with opportunities to engage online. We'll be making sure to provide a lot of communication and publicity about the opportunities through not just press releases and media outreach, but social media and other opportunities, signs at our trailheads, for example, like we've done in the past. And then when we're able to release the system overview report towards the end of February, that's when, once we have that great information to build engagement on, that's when we really ramp up our efforts in terms of that engagement with the on trails, with our education opportunities at housing communities, et cetera. That's when we're able to ramp up that process. In March, we're hoping to hold some kickoff listening events. And then we anticipate that we would close that first engagement window on March 30th. So what I wanted to do is just give you a couple of slides to highlight the changes in the project management plan that were reflected in the packet that you received that are different from the last time you saw it. And then I also want to share with you a few changes that were recommended today at the process committee meeting that are definitely new that you haven't heard. So in terms of the changes that you have seen in the project management plan, as you might remember, those were highlighted in green text, so those were different. We took an effort, as Mark mentioned, to improve that why statement and really help try and explain why it is we're doing the master plan. We also put some more detail around the system overview report and mentioned, for example, that we're adding that new and final chapter on trends. We made more clear that we'll use that report to inform engagement. And so, for example, that means that we'll use the graphics and materials that come out of that in summary form in our engagement efforts and at those listening events. We then updated the way we spoke about the city's engagement framework. As you heard Sarah say tonight, Council did recently adopt that on November 21st, I believe. And so that new language reflects that that is now an official framework we speak about, rather than saying the public participation working group. And the other thing that we've done is in order to be in alignment with that new framework, we identified those proposed levels of engagement for each of those engagement windows, as Sarah was talking about before. So where we are on that level of engagement. We then spoke about ways to improve alignment with steps 1 and 4. And so we heard some discussion around that. For example, Kevin, when you're asking that how do we better explain how we're defining that why and how we're doing that now within the context of the project management plan, but then also when we roll out the system overview report, that's another opportunity to further define that why. And then we have stated our intentions to conduct that scientific survey later in the process. Now, as I mentioned earlier today at the process committee, we heard some suggestions to improve the process, the project management plan even further, and I've summarized those here for the purposes of convenience. But what we're talking about primarily is further revising that why statement, and what I mean by that is those potential policy topics that I spoke of before, that list of examples, and that those are an opportunity, we have an opportunity to build those into that first page of the project management plan where we're describing the why in such a way that says, these are the potential topics we might need to explore. These are the kind of questions that we have on our minds, but what are the questions, community, do you have that you would like us to explore in the plan? And so that's gonna be our next best attempt to further refine that why statement, to get those concepts in there, and that was a suggestion that came from Tom and Kurt, and we really appreciate that, and the full committee supported that. There was also a suggestion, and Leah passed out the written example that Tom and Kurt provided us about a way to describe how we have laid out what is an ambitious schedule for the project, and that is that we're hoping to have this wrapped up in less than 2 years by early fall of 2019. That is still our goal, but that we're recognizing that we also want to make sure that this is a sound process and that we have opportunities at the end of each engagement window to speak with the process committee to say what worked, and did we get what we were looking for, or do we need to adjust course and make some changes? And so we recognize that that means that some changes might happen or that might affect the schedule. So those are the two major ways that I tried to summarize the changes that we heard from the process committee meeting, and certainly Tom and Kurt, I welcome any clarifications that you'd like to make on that. But in summary,
No, I think that's
does it?
captured it, yeah.
Okay, fantastic. And so in summary, what I wanted to say is that we're so grateful to have had this time to do this kind of project planning. It's not something that we are often graced with. And I also want to thank the process committee members for the time that you've spent and all the members of the public that have provided input and refinements to this. It's really been an improvement to our process. So I really want to say thank you to everyone for your time and comments on that. And I also want to say that I feel like the project management plan itself is now in its current state, and certainly with the final refinement suggested earlier today, that it's better reflecting a shared understanding of what to expect. And if you remember, that's a principle that is front and center in that new framework that Sarah spoke about before. And so we do feel like with the comments and changes we've gotten so far that we're in a much better place than when we started, so we're grateful for it. So our staff recommendation on this slide is slightly different than the one in the packet, and that's because of those changes that were recommended today by the process committee. And so that is that we're asking you to recommend that City Council approve the planning and engagement process for the OSMP master plan as outlined in the project management plan that you have in your packet, and as amended by the process committee today. So with that, I welcome any questions, and then I imagine we'll open it up for the public hearing.
Are we going to the public first or questions now?
Just a quick clarification on the staff recommendation. So the amendments would be to incorporate this paragraph that we were passed around. And then, I don't know, maybe a slide 5 to 10 somewhere, the list of.
That's right.
If you could flip back to that list.
Yes, you bet.
Please.
Yeah. Oop, there you go.
Yeah.
There it
So
is.
incorporate this into page 2 with the why statement.
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Well, yeah, do you have this where you could put it up so the public also sees what we were handed out?
Good thought.
While Leah's doing that, are there any questions too that I could answer or clarify?
Questions, Kevin?
Go ahead, somebody else. I'm conjugating.
I'm just curious if our process committee members had anything else to add. I mean, you already gave Leah the thumbs
I didn't
up,
have any,
I'm sure.
just a couple sort of color comments. One was there was some substantial, both in content and in number, of comments from the public. There were, I don't know exactly, about 8 or 9 people who attended, and 6 of whom gave comments. I'm happy to discuss that. I'm always reluctant to sort of characterize what people have said because they weren't all saying the same thing. But I think it is fair to say that the public was quite engaged and, had some very specific thoughts on, change. Well, in some cases, it was just sort of directionally, make sure you do broad engagement. In other cases, it was, I think you really need to change something. But I would, happy to go into more detail, but I think it's, the broad point was we had some very substantial and sort of substantive public comment. I don't know whether we will reach the time when we struggle to complete meetings, depending on how much this expands, but we're already, it's tough to get these done in an hour.
We'll have to talk, Tom. Yeah.
No, I just recognize
Yes,
the issue.
it's tough.
I'm not proposing
Absolutely.
a solution. but I
The
recognize-
trend line is ominous. And I would just echo what Tom said. I think the changes you're proposing address a lot. I won't say all of the public's concerns, but particularly about helping the public understand more of the why are we doing this. And then some concerns about, is the schedule really long enough to accommodate what is an undefined scope at this point? And I think the public recognizes there's a lot of uncertainty about which way the process will go. And accommodating that, I think, is part of what you proposed.
Yeah, I guess I would add the one comment from the public that we haven't attempted to address was the comment that we should define the sideboards up front. And I would just, I would just say we did not, at the process committee meeting, address whether that, it's not really in the current plan, whether ultimately that's something that needs to be in there or not. But I would say it was the one, sort of directly substantive comment that didn't yet grapple with.
Right. Excuse me, the plan says up front and clearly that the charter are the main sideboards. But then there are questions about, well, what else is in play? And I think that's a fair question. And I'm not sure we fully know the answer to that. And I think staff can try to think more and illustrate more what it means to have something discussed at the level of a master plan as opposed to the level of an implementation plan. And so I think those illustrations will help address more for the public what really is in play and what's the discussion going to be about as opposed to what it's not going to be about.
And I would offer, too, that in the system overview report itself, we'll have a chapter on purposes, plans, and policies. And so I think to a large extent, it will address that desire, that need to have sideboards. And then I will also say that in that final chapter, as I mentioned, as we think across our charter purposes and the potential trends that might affect our ability to deliver on those, we are trying to highlight some of the current management approaches that are already in play, existing, that help us address those. So I think we're coming at it from a couple of different angles. But you're absolutely right, Kurt. The one thing that is absolutely sacrosanct in this process is the city charter, that we do not intend to come out with a recommendation to make changes to that.
I think kind of building on what Kurt was saying, I had a meeting earlier today where some people brought us some really good suggestions of providing examples of open-ended questions that prime the pump. The ideas of as population continues to grow in the Front Range, what do you want to see happen with our open space? As acquisition of land becomes more and more expensive and the cost of maintaining our land also does, how do you see this? Those are good sort of open, not like we need to stop buying land, but as it becomes more expensive, what do you want to do? And then another thing that was brought up to me that I think is actually a really good thing to kind of conjugate on or think about is in these sort of initial why statements that you have in here, where you talk about priorities. I think it might be good to say what trade-offs are you willing to make? Because we can say we have a priority for conservation and a priority for recreation and a priority for this. They are not compatible. At the fundamental level, the more you do one, the less you'll be able to do the other. And that's a trade-off. And I think that's a good way to start thinking about this. And then what are the consequences to not just you, but the public for this trade-off? Because people tend to think about what's it going to do for them, but how is it going to affect everything? I think those are good, opening questions that instead of saying, here's a plan, what do you think? Which I know that's not what you want to do. This gives the people a chance to say, oh, this is what the questions you're trying to answer are.
I appreciate that, Kevin, and we've heard that suggestion as well, and absolutely intend that scientific survey to be an opportunity to ask those sort of trade-off questions. It's modeled after, for example, something that was similarly done in the Boulder Valley Comprehensive Plan, where those trade-offs were explored in that format.
Yeah.
So I appreciate that.
Sure.
Mm-hmm.
I feel like in the context of the portfolio, it's going to be really important that we still keep with, identifying all our previous plans and using them. And that needs to be clarified in language. I think there's no language really that says that a lot. When I look at this, if I was just John Q. Public, I wouldn't get that the grassland plans in this, and so I think spelling out, and that's probably further down the road, but I think is very important to the process. As a portfolio, it was clear, but we're seeming to get away from that language.
No, and I think you're right, Molly. That's definitely will be a focus, because if you think about it, part of the master plan is not to say everything's going to be new. It'll be framing policy questions And if the answer is we have an existing policy that works and looking at future trends doesn't need to be changed, we'll be affirming that policy. Sometimes we'll say it needs refined, other times we'll say, oh, based on that question, we need new policy. So we'll definitely return to that, and that will be a focus to make sure we have continuity that follows through from existing policy. It's a great point you're making.
But one thing that sort of is an overarching issue for the process committee is I think candidly there are differing opinions on the primacy of the schedule. There are those who really, place a very high priority on sticking to the schedule, and there are those who think that this is an incredibly ambitious undertaking in the time available to us. And what Kurt and I were trying to do in what this is trying to strike a middle ground to say, we don't go to the next step until we are in agreement, as best we can, that we've completed the prior step. And if that gets us to the end within the time frame, awesome. If it becomes clear that we're just becoming schedule-driven and not really completing one step before jumping to the next, we're sort of saying, we'll just take a pause and think, have we really completed this step? And it's sort of that middle ground between being purely schedule-driven and being just substance-driven and letting the schedule automatically slip. And that's what we were trying to accomplish there.
And one thing we saw today that we hadn't seen before is just sort of a preview, is staff giving an example of the sorts of objectives and methods and strategies that would be used for the first phase. And so I think we're converging in our thinking, and all this does is sort of canonize that and say, yeah, you're going to do that for each phase, and then consciously visit it at the end of each phase.
Yeah, I think, oh, sorry, Andrea.
Oh, well, I actually have a question about what it means to successfully complete a step in the process. Because I have concerns that successfully completing a step in the process could be interpreted as everybody in the community kumbaya agrees.
No, right.
And I want to avoid that because it's impossible to have a process where everybody agrees on every single step.
And we finesse that here. We basically charge staff before a phase starts to say what we're going to try to accomplish in that phase. And I assume staff will not come back and say, everyone in Boulder will agree. I think they'll come back with a measured set of objectives that hopefully people could agree, those are important, and we think there's a way to determine whether we've done that. Now, you're right, everything can be done to a better extent, and that's the devil in the details, but at least that's the concept, I think.
It is, and just to go back to what we were also speaking about before, because I think they're related, is that obviously when you think about how to manage a project, the basic things that relate to each other are scope, schedule, and budget, and so those are all things that we need to keep in mind as staff so that we are managing within the confines of our ability to deliver on this plan. And so to Kurt's point, just to give you a flavor of what these process committee meetings will look like, we had today an example of a worksheet that we have developed, as Kurt said, to define what that first window of engagement looks like, what the key dates are, what the tools and the techniques are, the target audiences, the communication tools that we'll use. And there's a final piece at the bottom that says, how did this go? Did we get what we intended to get? Are there adjustments that we need to make going forward? Are there things that we need to document that we've learned for the future? And so that would be an opportunity to then come back to the process committee towards the end or after an engagement window closes and have that conversation to close that and make a decision. Okay, we might not have gotten an A+, but we got a B, and so we're okay with that. And in order to keep on schedule as best we can and keep within our budget, we're okay with that B.
Okay. Public input?
Yes, but I had a question before we get to the public, about the public. So under this engagement strategy that we're doing, after people speak tonight, and what's our next step between now and the process and before it starts? It feels like there's an abyss after tonight somewhat. It's kind of like this train starts rolling. And that's where I think public gets concerned. So what do we do with the comments and the input that we are receiving tonight? How does that get put into the first phase so that people feel inclusive?
So I would offer that it's certainly within your purview to recommend any additional changes to the project management plan that you would like to see, and we could change that motion as we similarly did with the recommendations from the process committee to say that you approve it with these changes, and then we can make those changes and provide that draft to council for them to approve.
Okay, great.
I had one more thought that I thought of, then I forgot, then I thought up again. So one thing that I think might actually help the public in some of this engagement. So a lot of the time what happens is we get like us and the public get a 400-page document a week before we're supposed to vote on it, think about it, whatever. And one thing I think might be helpful is, could you serialize any of this? So like you have this big thing that you have 2 months from January right to March to do stuff, and halfway through we get this big document. But you might be able to both save yourself and everyone else a little bit and be like, mid-January, here's the first 30 pages of, like, this is the first 2 sections. Chew on that, people. And then, like, end of January is another section. And so that way we all have time to digest it. You're not working to get everything done by one deadline. And I think that might give people more to think about. If you have like chapter 1, tune in next week for chapter 2, might really help all of us, because then we're not trying to digest 400 pages at once.
No, it's a good approach. And I think you might have noticed a recent practice where we've kind of been bringing like chapter outlines, which form the sort of skeleton, and then we're bringing the meat, as it were, for that skeleton later.
Yeah.
And so maybe a similar approach like that is helpful. Here's early things we're hearing, here are things where we're hearing consolidation, collaboration, agreement. Here's areas where we're seeing disagreement, which will need further debate. So perhaps we can sort of bring it up as findings as we go, being careful that we want to respect the engagement window at the same time to make sure it's inclusive, and we're following that new guidance we have.
I think the other thing, thank you, that we're trying to do also is, because this is a system-wide plan, that there are implications across certain chapters and certain topics that we want to be cognizant of and respect. And so I think that by putting a report together with a thoughtful outline so that we are able to draw conclusions across those chapters, there's an integrity to how we've designed it. But we're also looking at opportunities, once we have that report, to use social media to say, pull out some of those findings. Did you know that we support this many mammals, or those sorts of things, to tease out some of those findings. And we'll certainly, as I mentioned, support those, bring those findings with us at those engagement opportunities, at the meetings. We intend to also come back to the board in mid-March at that meeting and present the key findings to the full board.
YouTube videos with clowns and puppets and stuff might help.
Scope creep, Kevin, I have to manage it.
Yeah.
Oh, even more excitement. I'll pass that down to you.
Okay. So we'll start the public input. First one is Ellen Feinberg.
Ellen Feinberg, 335 17th Street. I'm speaking on behalf of Plan Boulder County. We've been following this process since before the actual planning started and providing input as part of the Boulder Environmental Coalition. I think that when we looked at the, I'm not sure, I'm going to call it the Public Participation Working Group because I can't remember what the new acronym is, but the work that they did to try and identify why public processes were going sideways, they did some case studies, and one of the things that came out of that was the very, very high priority importance of defining what the problem is to be solved. Many times the public was providing input on a completely different project than was actually being undertaken. The timelines have been, in a lot of public process, really compressed, so the public engagement process really felt to the public like a hoop, that they were just a step that had to be gone through, and that the timeline was really driving the process rather than the input from the public. So I think you've heard a lot of solutions to this problem. In the end, it's the quality of the input, not the process. And I mean, we're spending a lot of time talking about the process, but in the end, we want to get to a really good result. I think that the communication needs to be two ways. There's a lot of detailed information on the open space master plan and the system that it's trying to preserve that is going to require the public to have a lot of education about this so that the input they provide can be useful and that they can feel like they are providing input that is affecting the system. We have one area that we wanted to really mention, and that is what's now called the System Overview Report. It's been called the portfolio, and I think years past it's been a collection of studies and information that's been in the open space library that some people knew pieces of, but there was no assembly of. And that this report is going to be really critical to advising and educating the public on what the system is that we're going to be trying to preserve over the next 50 years. The first 50 years were easier because there weren't so many people, but now we have some real huge population pressures. So the plan for how this 100-page document is going to hit the public and how you're going to assess the input and whether or not the input has, the assessment of the response has met your goals is going to be really important. Thank you.
Thank you, Ellen. Next one is Jackie Ray.
Hi, my name is Jackie Ramaley. I live at 2305 Dartmouth Avenue in Boulder. I speak tonight on behalf of the Boulder chapter of the Colorado Native Plant Society. We have read the December 8 green draft of the project management plan and are most concerned about the explicitly stated purpose of the master plan. The PPWG direction for community involvement states in the, quote, 5 core principles and values of good public engagement that, number 1, the problem is clearly defined. We feel that identifying, quote, what priorities should guide how Boulder enjoys and protects its special open space legacy, end quote, is not enough. Instead, we should direct the master plan to sustain the open space system while balancing competing values and priorities, increased usage, and environmental factors such as climate change. We would also like to see the systems overview report presented to the public in both full, scientific, detailed format, as well as a condensed and easy-to-read format without sacrificing content. As the PPWG stated as number 2 in the previously mentioned report, it is important to inform and educate in early stages for well-grounded understanding of issues rather than later involvement with hardened and polarized positions. Surveying the public will no doubt come along quickly, and we want ample time for the public to be educated about the valuable ecological resources our open space system protects and how those resources can be threatened by human disturbances such as increased usage. Thank you.
Thank you, Jackie. Ray Bridge. And Kurt, I have not forgotten you're next.
I'm Raymond Bridge, 435 South 38th Street in Boulder, and I'm speaking on behalf of the 1,600-plus members of the Boulder County Audubon Society. What you are being asked to do tonight is to approve the process for the master plan, which is also presented as being intended to serve as an example of the public process implementing the recommendations of the PPWG. So far, the indications are not encouraging. The system overview, formerly the portfolio, was scheduled to come to you and the public in October. Now it is promised for late February. The schedule slips seem to be compensated for by reducing the amount of time allowed for public comment and the time for incorporating public comment, the so-called engagement windows in the document. If we want to advance the schedule, I submit that this is exactly the wrong way to go about it. Release the system overview earlier, get comments on it early, and be proactive about taking those comments seriously rather than being defensive and holding back. These same issues are clear throughout the proposed process. We need to clearly define the objectives of each step, get real public input, and take it into account before proceeding to the next step. It is particularly concerning that a basic statement of the problem that will be addressed by the master plan has been so long coming, despite the fact that members of the public identified much of this to the planning team very early on, many months ago. Future trends section in the overview was specifically recommended then by a previous trustee on this board. Clear statement of the sideboard should be made at the very beginning so that the scope is clear to all. If we are revisiting the grasslands plan or the visitor master plan as part of this, we're not talking about a single term of council. We're talking about 3, 4, or 5 terms of council. The original visitor master plan took 3 terms of council to get done. If we open that up, it's not going to take any less. On the problem and the scope, it is clear that we are dealing with reductions in funding that are rapidly approaching. Transition from large-scale acquisition to maintenance of the system, increasing demands for recreation from the population of the entire North Metro area, maintenance requirements, climate change, and the need to balance protection of ecosystem integrity with desired public access. That is, balancing the various charter purposes. Thank you.
Thank you, Ray. Kurt, you're up.
Kurt Cunningham, speaking on behalf of the Indian Peace Group Sierra Club. The question is, who is the public? And that's making comments. My contention would be, having gone through a number of public processes, that in fact only a minor percentage of the public, the whole public, the tax-paying public, ever participates. And so it seems to me that the idea of having a scientific survey is the best way to gauge how people value the open space system and how various trade-offs should be made. Now, last year, there was a survey of a similar type to that. And I thought, I read it through, and I thought it was quite good. It illustrated how people felt about open space uses and how what sort of things they might be willing to give up if the population booms and visitation has to be limited some way. So when you have the sort of public processes I think we're talking about, you tend to get groups that are already organized participating, but that doesn't necessarily include the vast bulk of the population that pays taxes for open space and uses open space in large numbers, but has no detailed opinion about it, but has feelings about it. So that's the major point I wanted to make. And I think that the charter and the professional staff that you have are the things that filter the various interests in open space and determine what can go forward in face of various pressures and what needs to be curtailed, if anything needs to be curtailed. So I think it's important to maintain the integrity of the staff's expertise and to respect that. People can give their opinions if they have organized opinions about it, but the staff are the ones that are charged with making the decisions that, of course, can be overseen and overruled by the city council or whatever, but nevertheless, that's where their expertise lies, and that's what we have to respect. And of course, the charter. The charter is the filter through which everything is put. It has, in most cases, it's a pretty general document. It has some contrary requirements, but nevertheless, it's a filter, and it has to be respected, and we want it to be respected as time goes on. And of course, the final screen for all our process is financial. And what do you do with, you have less money and more people? Those decisions have to be laid out in any sort of plan. Now, of course, any plan you make can be changed next year if the city council decides, well, this is no good, we have to do something else. Or the conditions change so rapidly that it's not set in stone. It's just difficult to do it, but it's not set in stone once it's done. So those are the points I wanted to make impressions. Thank you.
Thank you, Kurt. One more. Karen Holweck.
Karen Holweg, 4440 Greenbrier Boulevard. I'm very interested in seeing this master plan succeed as a model implementation of the public participation working group process that was recommended to council last year. And as I've been reviewing the documents for the management of the process, I've talked recently with 3 different members of the Public Participation Working Group to make sure that I understand their recommendations and how they're being applied here. And what they've told me and have emphasized repeatedly is that these early plannings to plan steps should be given the time they deserve and not rushed, and that it's essential to be explicit about what you're doing up front. Those are direct quotes from conversations and emails back and forth with them. I think the kinds of revisions that have been made based on today's suggestions have been good, and I really appreciate the addition of this note about the calendar and how to proceed, and the addition of the examples of the kinds of issues that were on the screen. But I'd like to mention 2 examples that leave me with questions, and I don't know if it's just my difficulty in hearing and understanding what's going on, or whether there's a concern, a greater concern for the process. The 2 examples have to do with how clear the statement of the purpose is on the second page of the document that we're currently working with. I've heard a lot of comments both this evening and at the process committee meeting earlier today about the need to revise the statement and not just include in it an identification of priorities, but to say something more. A short while ago, Kevin suggested adding something specifically about trade-offs. And in response to that, I heard Darren say something about, yes, we're going to have a survey about trade-offs later in 2018. That still doesn't address the question of, are trade-offs and those kinds of substantive discussions going to be mentioned to the public as part of the purpose of doing this master plan. And if that's going to happen, it's going to require revising what's on page 2 rather than saying we're going to do a survey on that later in 2018. The other one that I want to mention is on this planning for engagement, first engagement window detail that was passed out at the meeting earlier today. And there have been questions about whether comments are going to be taken about the system overview report, and the answer has always been, oh yes, we're going to take comments on that. But then it says at the bottom of this document, comments about improving the system overview report will be documented for future updates to the report following completion of the master plan. And my question is, how can you take comments in the first step of a 2-year process and say, and we'll use those 2 years from now? One of the things that the Public Participation Working Group said is that when comments are not accepted, there should be an explanation of why they're not accepted. It's not that everybody, as Andrea said earlier, it's not that everybody will be happy and everybody's comments can be taken. But if they're not going to be taken, there needs to be an explanation of why, rather than just swept over the rug and keep going down the path. Thank you.
Thank you, Karen. Okay. Further questions? Comments? Comments about public comments? Nothing.
I would reiterate what Karen just reiterated about what I said earlier in the previous discussion with Karen, which is, I think that it's probably pretty valuable on this page 2 to adjust the text so that it's explicit about trade-offs and consequences for that matter.
I'm going to push back on that for a second because I'm a little torn. I agree that as we go through this process, we're going to discover there's trade-offs, and I want to understand the motivation for including that statement up front. Is it to just kind of prep the community that you can't have your cake and eat it too, that we're probably going to discover some trade-offs? Or I guess I want to understand the underlying motivation here.
My thinking is this entire plan is about trade-offs. It's not about priorities. We all could say, I prioritize this, you prioritize that, or I think this is valuable, you think that is valuable. And probably almost everyone who is engaged in the process and most of the people who would ever use open space would agree on 90% of those things. But the things we don't agree on will almost necessarily require trade-offs. And I think that's a lot of what's going to be involved in this. The most difficult questions we're going to have are not going to be the things that we all agree on, because I think most of those staff will do a wonderful job of presenting, here's what we think is a good idea, and everyone will say, check. It's the things that we don't all agree on as being a good idea. And I think one of the challenges we've had in previous public processes is that there's no explicit understanding right from the beginning that if you want something, you're going to give something. Mm-hmm. And if you want something and you give something, there's also going to be a consequence in terms of whether it affects the environment or recreation or our budget. And to not roll that trade-off and the consequence into this discussion, which we almost never do, I don't feel that we have a really good legitimate basis for a good discourse. What we have is, I'm going to say what I want louder than you. And therefore, I've come and done my public process. And I think that the reason why I want it in the beginning is just that it's very explicit that we say, hey, you know what, this is going to be really hard. And it's about evaluating all these things that we all value and trying to find what the right mix is. It's about the social norms and political norms that we have as a society in Boulder, or Boulder County. And I think that's really important to address. I think that saying I prioritize this over that doesn't have a sense of what happens when I do that. What's the trade-off? what's the consequence? That's all.
I'm trying to craft a question that we can add on to go with that, but at this time, I'll add that, although I stated it as pushing back, I mean, I in fact agree with you. Having previously served on the Transportation Advisory Board and gone through the Transportation Master Plan update and coming up with these policy prescriptions, very much so we found in the community that it's like, okay, we make these decisions that we want to put these policies forward, but by not providing a grounding in reality of what the implications of those policies are, what it's going to feel like when you implement those policies, then you go forward as a board with good faith. Oh, I'm implementing this policy that everyone agreed to, and then they're like, whoa, that's not actually what I meant. So trying to bring that into the community discussion of what those implications are, I think is beneficial in setting that up front. So I was trying to craft a statement. It's like, to follow what priorities should guide how Boulder enjoys and protects its open space legacy? Add-on question, how can we ground these priorities in reality, realizing that some trade-offs may be necessary? Something like that.
That would help me a lot.
Does it need to say trade-offs? Can it be compromise? You don't see
what's the right
compromise word.
Well, one word is balanced.
Right.
I mean, you could just say what priorities should guide how Boulder enjoys and protects its open space legacy, its special open space legacy, including how those priorities should be applied and balanced. That gives you that takes it one step further.
Yeah.
I think it's too political. I think like saying to say compromise and balance, to say trade-offs and consequences is much more explicit. I think balanced and compromise is what you would say if you're talking to someone else who understands policy really well, to say, there's a bunch of trade-offs here and there's going to be consequences. But if you're trying to make a public statement here to say, this is a serious conversation and there's going to be things that we're going to be sacrificing. Because we will. There's no way to go about this without having some things come out better in some places and some things worse. I would take balanced over nothing, but I feel like having some stronger wording that conveys the seriousness, it might actually bring more people into the public process. And it also gives a sense of like, we need to actually find the balance, the compromise through this discussion. But like I said, I'll take whatever you give.
I guess one question is, do we want to try to draft something, or are we comfortable kicking it to the staff and saying, you've heard the concerns about incorporating the issue of trade-offs and balancing of competing objectives or whatever.
Yeah.
Please work something like that into this part of the plan. I can go either way. It's your call, Andrea.
If you pinky swear that you would do something, I'm fine with that.
Having expressed my concern and heard the same from Kevin, I largely defer to Darren and our process committee members on this one. You guys have spent way more brain power on this than I have.
I don't know about that.
Well, I'm very happy to take a stab at that. And certainly if you recommend in the motion that we had, that council approve this version with your changes, we're also happy to bring back those changes in January. We are wanting to make sure, again, that the purpose of putting this project management plan together, again, is to make sure we have a shared understanding of what to expect. And I think to that point, that this conversation that we're having and the community input that we've received so far is building towards that shared understanding. So as long as we agree on that and the core of what you want to make sure gets included in there, I'm happy to draft that and make sure it works.
And I would add one more thing to your list of things to draft if the board agrees. You said this is a requirement of the city and the comp plan, and I don't think it says that anywhere here. So
It needs to be
if it is a
front and center.
requirement, I don't think we should be shy about that.
That's
So
fair.
I would add that to the list.
I think also in what will be included, I think there's been quite a bit of input about, specifying things that are in the sideboards, or as you will, the system overview report. I think we should, and I don't know where that would fit in, but probably under what will be included, and I know we have not specified everything, but I think we should line out that we intend to use existing reports, use examples, grassland plan, et cetera, as a framework for the portfolio, so that that's in what will be included. I'd feel more comfortable.
And that's actually, we've got it stated on page 4, which is integration with existing citywide and OSMP plans and policies, but we could probably state that more clearly by sort of quoting some of the plans. Molly, that might help.
I think it would be good to have it there as well,
Okay.
because that's been a common
So spell it out a bit more.
comment.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay.
And then we're adding this, my understanding is that we're also adding, how does this, the calendar note, does that get
So that would be
put in, or?
in the motion language that we're proposing here, that last phrase, as amended by process committee on December 13th, 2017, those are those recommendations. So that would get included in the changes.
Okay.
And so in a motion, we would add a phrase saying, and the recommended changes made by the board at this meeting.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Handle it that way.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
Do we all have a sufficiently clear understanding of what changes we're recommending right now?
I'm happy to summarize.
They had a
That'd be
couple of
good.
PowerPoints. You had PowerPoints that summarized the changes from earlier today.
Right, so that would be the, as amended by process committee, right?
Right,
So
and
then
if you-
what are we doing right now, is what I'm trying to clarify.
Let me try and summarize, Adrian, and see if I've gotten it. How about that?
Right.
Okay. So three major things that I heard. So the first is to further refine that why statement to get in that concept of trade-offs or compromise. The second is to add that it's a requirement by the City of Boulder and the Boulder Valley Comprehensive Plan. And the third is to further spell out on page 4, in terms of what will be included, our integration with the existing plans and policies. Did I miss anything, or any clarifications?
I don't think you missed anything, but just to clarify, I think a lot of people have asked, how does it fit with those other plans? So not just building on integration, but like, it sits here, these other plans are here underneath it, or however that works.
Didn't we have a graphic like that?
Yeah, we did.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I mean, I keep visualizing that graphic in my brain.
Sure.
So maybe it just needs to be in here.
Sure. Yeah, we could do that. It's in the system overview report as well, but yes, absolutely, we could do something like that.
Okay. I'm good.
Yes, I have questions about, because to me, it's a bit, I'm sorry, but to me, it's a big question, compromise versus trade-offs. I guess I'm kind of stuck on that. And, if we haven't resolved some of this, not sure we're ready to go ahead and approve the process if we don't have it clearly defined.
Okay.
I mean, it's as amended.
Are you I'm trying to understand, so are you wanting to make sure that the board is in support of using the word trade-offs or not?
Right.
Okay.
Or balance, or, right. So,
Well, Molly, as an idea, I mean, I would be comfortable with asking staff to craft a statement, put it in here, and say, this was new and not approved when they go to council. You know, like, we were trying to capture what the Open Space Board of Trustees was saying here, and they're trying to convey, you know, something about political trade-offs, and let council tweak it from there. You know, it's essentially a political statement. I don't know, maybe that's going too far.
And am I right, we would have an opportunity as a board before it goes to council to say, yeah, that's good, you got it right. Even if we're not revisiting the motion to proceed or.
No, this is
went to council.
January
No.
4th packet.
We don't.
Yeah.
okay.
But what I want to make clear in terms of, you know, sometimes it's so easy to get caught up in the words, and because I do it all the time. But what we're really doing here is confirming something core to the process. And what that means is that we are agreeing and stating up front that as part of engagement, as part of the way we design those activities, those meetings, that format for engagement, that we want to make sure that we're building an understanding of the kinds of trade-offs and compromises that we need to make in order to deliver on the charter. And so, for example, one tool is that scientific survey that we've proposed. Perhaps there are other ways, engagement methods that we can approach in designing those meetings, for example, that we could also administer. But just to make sure that that's the core of what we're doing here, then as long as we agree on that, then I believe, you know, in fact, when we were just here, Mark was just Googling the definition of trade-off, and I promise you that in there, the words compromise and balance were both there. So I feel pretty comfortable with what we could craft.
Okay.
That it would reflect your concerns.
I think it's, you know, letter of the law versus interpretation of the law. If you could trust us to get, you know, the interpretation of the law correct here. And then as we go to council, if we've made a major mistake, you can let us know. And as we talk to council, we can even explain it. And at that point, it's more noted that, hey, we need to provide extra emphasis in how we describe that purpose.
Yeah.
So I think it's, yeah, we'd be happy to take our best shot at it.
I'd also add, I think a lot of the actual trading off comes at the implementation stage. The master plan can identify some trade-offs and give some general guidance on how to, you know, how to think about that in the context of a particular situation. But in almost any particular situation, the balance may tip one way or the other, depending on the specifics. And there's a level in terms of doing the trade-off that we're just not going to get into. But
And a way to think about that, perhaps, Tom, is it's almost like at a scale level. Like by choosing focus areas, there's a trade-off or a sense of priority, whichever way you want to look at it, in terms of by saying these are the focus areas for like the next 10 years we're going to work on. Well, it's not that we're not going to work on other stuff in the system, but it gives a sense of priority within those focus areas. Then as you get to the strategies, there's another sense of trade-off because those strategies are saying these are the areas within the focus areas that will have real clear direction on. So if you think of that, and then when you get to implementation, you're getting down to like the metrics, the exact numbers of it. So I think thinking of it at that scale level sort of helps sort of consider it.
are we?
And I would like to capture in that at each of those steps, that when you prioritize one thing, make it clear what is implicitly deprioritized.
Mm-hmm.
So that gives people a sense of the trade-off, in quotes, you know, to make those things explicit.
And it's interesting because it's not like we wouldn't manage natural resources, cultural resources, ag lands,
Yeah.
or, you know, it's like the emphasis
Right.
or the intensity within that. Yeah.
Yeah, the word emphasis is not a bad word to have in there, too, when you're talking about priorities and areas of emphasis. And it's a more positive thing. So I'm comfortable with their wordsmithing.
As am I.
All right, then I will move, I have a slight wording change, but move the Open Space Board of Trustees, I guess recommend that
City Council approve the planning and engagement process for the OSMP Master Plan as outlined in the Project Management Plan and as amended by the Process Committee and the Open Space Board of Trustees on December 13, 2017.
Very efficient. I'll second the motion.
Oh, dang it. As the second.
All in favor?
Did you
vote? I am against.
Okay.
Yes. Because I don't feel comfortable not having it in front of me, so, with the changes.
So, one thing, not to belabor this, but one of the things we discussed at a prior meeting was, it's up to you, particularly since you're the chair, is do you want to say something, maybe you've said what you want, said your piece, but one of the things we discussed was if someone dissents, do they want to make a more substantial statement, and then Leah will note in the minutes, at the 3-hour and 17-minute mark, where that is. Totally up to you, but I just wanted to remind that we had discussed that.
Yeah, and I was prepared to say that.
Okay, sorry.
I feel like we're moving this along to meet the agenda for council, which I appreciate. I would feel more comfortable if we saw all the changes written out and we could read it first. So I guess that's why I feel uncomfortable going ahead and passing it, given that the language to me of trade-off feels significantly different than the word balance and compromise. Just given what I went through with the North TSA, it feels like a different thing. So that would be the way I feel about it, and that's why I voted against it. So, okay, other comments, anything?
Well, again, I want to thank everybody for their time on this.
Thank you.
Thanks, Darren.
Okay.
We are adjourned.